everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Directors Club. I am your host, Jim Laskowski. And recently, for the 1992 retrospective episode, I had the immense joy of going back to revisit a film called A Midnight Clear. And one of my film critic friends and guests for that episode said, I think this might be Keith Gordon's best work. And, well, I honestly think he's made consistently great work ever since his directorial debut, and he happens to be one of my favorite returning guests, back for a yearly tradition that I always look forward to. He remains one of my favorite filmmakers, actors, cinephiles, an all-around terrific guy and conversationalist that I'm so glad I had the pleasure of connecting with several years ago. I feel blessed, grateful. Welcome back, the one and only Keith Gordon.
Wow, that was really nice, and I'm really happy to be here. I love doing these with you. I really enjoy it. And look, I enjoy talking to you, not on podcasts. You and I have a lot of things that we share in common about the kinds of films that we love, and even when we are different, I always find the conversations really interesting, and that they sort of open my brain up. So I'm happy to do it for an audience, but I'm always happy to talk to you just to talk to you. So I'm really glad to be here.
I feel exactly the same way. And again, if I could go back in time and, well, it would be awkward for my younger, maybe 10-year-old self to encounter the 40-something-year-old version of me. But I would love to tell my 10-year-old self, hey, you're going to be having conversations with that great actor from Christine someday. Because again, we were just talking about, I was off mic about John Carpenter and the fact that the Music Box recently showed a 70mm print of Starman. But no, Christine was one of those first movies, probably one of the first horror movies I saw as a kid, and just instantly fell for it. And I've probably told you this before, but my dad was kind enough to edit out all the swear words so I could watch it.
Did tell me that. That's really, wow.
Yeah, he wanted me to see it.
That would have been a large job.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure, the Buddy Repperton stuff was probably completely cut out. Who knows? Oh, yeah. But, and really quickly, this could just be, because as everybody knows, we're going to talk about underrated films from a particular decade. But I had a recent experience going back to seeing Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me on the big screen, which I hadn't seen. Obviously, again, 1992 retrospective choice. And Sheryl Lee's performance in that should have won every award imaginable. And I don't know why I didn't absolutely love it the first time I saw it, because I am a David Lynch freak. And I'm just curious if you had any memories or stories of working with Sheryl Lee, because I have gone on record in saying you've done one of the better adaptations of Vonnegut I've ever seen with Mother Night. And really, I am so floored by what Sheryl Lee does in Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and seeing that on the big screen again sort of cemented that for me, and just think she's phenomenal. And she's great in Mother Night too.
Well, the truth is she's a monster. She's just a horrible human being who uses those. No, she's really one of the sweetest people I've ever met in my life.
I'm sure.
She's, a wonderful, wonderful actress. And I do think, a kind of criminally underappreciated actress. I think she has, I've worked with a few people like that, Billy Crudup. I mean, it's getting better for him as he's gotten older, but I've worked with a few of these people who are physically gorgeous. So like everybody assumes that their talent is that they're great looking, and it's like, no, they're really great actors who just happen to be great looking. And I do think Sheryl is a brilliant actress, and I completely agree with you about Fire Walk with Me. And she's very brave and very bold and but fun to work with. I mean, she's really inventive, and I haven't talked to her in a while, but we stayed friends after the film. I really dug her. I'm trying to think if there's like some great anecdote. But it wasn't, she was actually pretty quiet and focused on the work. Worked really hard. She went out and found this amazing tutor to help her work on the German accent, and very, very, very specific. Like, I remember that about her. She wanted to be very specific about what part of Germany the accent was from, and what, she was just very dedicated, and yet lovely and happy and kind to the crew, and we were all sort of in love with her. I mean, she was just like one of those people that you were really happy on the day she was working. There's always people like that on a movie where it's like, oh, they're here today. That's so good. And she was definitely one of those people. And it was a super hard role. I mean, in Mother Night. And once again, Nick Nolte got all the attention because he had the really showy role, and it was also a super hard role. But Sheryl was essentially playing two different characters, and yet two different characters who had to be alike enough that one of the characters could convince somebody deeply in love with her that she was the other character, which is really subtle because it's like, how far do you push it? And she was just great with it, and she could make these tiny little adjustments, and I could say whatever 5% more Helga and she would just do it. And I love her, and I'm really sorry that she hasn't gotten more just acclaim as a great actress and more work as a great actress.
Agreed.
Because,
yeah.
I mean, maybe as she gets older, she will too. I mean, certainly like with Billy Crudup, when we did Waking the Dead, he was still struggling against the hot young leading man thing. And now, as the years have gone by, he's getting to play more and more consistently, more and more interesting character roles. And I think Sheryl is very much a character actress in a leading woman's body. I think she's really somebody that should be playing all sorts of roles. And I think she got ghettoized by the fact that she was blonde and beautiful. And, so people were like, oh, well, we'll give her like the girlfriend parts. And she actually did a remarkable job, if you look at the body of her work, of doing a lot of things that weren't that, even if it meant taking films that were more off the radar or smaller things or whatever. She really kind of stuck true to just trying to do really good work on interesting projects instead of capitalizing on, oh, can I get to be a star? But I feel like I haven't seen her in anything in a little while, which is, I'm realizing, is pretty sad.
I guess it was probably just the last season of Twin Peaks: The Return, where she showed up and had a very memorable final moment of that season.
True, but I don't know what she was doing around that. I don't know if it took Lynch bringing her back. I mean, I'd have to go look it up, but I don't even know if she's like just gave up on the whole thing. I mean, at a certain point, I'm sure people feel like, oh, screw it. I've worked hard enough at this long enough that if people aren't going to offer me the stuff I deserve to do, why would I keep doing it?
Yeah, and I also just mentioned that too because I wanted to sort of incept this into people's brains to track down Mother Night, because it's just again, it's just one of the better adaptations of Vonnegut that I've ever seen, and that's hard to pull off. His writing is very tricky, and a lot of people have attempted to do that, even with a pretty decent Slaughterhouse-Five. But
yes, I actually really like Slaughterhouse-Five, and I think Kurt was really happy with it too. That was one that I think captured a lot of what he was doing as a writer.
Yeah.
And and really with Mother Night, and I thank you for the kind words, and I'm proud of it. I think a lot of credit on that, though, also has to go to Bob Whitey, who produced it with me, but he wrote the screenplay, and he was very close to Kurt. In fact, he just had a documentary come out about his 4-year friendship with Kurt. So that because Bob's been primarily a documentarian, and I felt like he did a remarkable job when he wrote the script of capturing Kurt's voice. So, then as a director, I could try to find the visual equivalents and but if the writing hadn't been good, you could just so easily screw that up with, trying to translate Kurt to the screen. And I think Bob did an amazing job of staying very, very close to what Kurt wrote, but not being a slave to it and being willing to, and Kurt would joke about the fact that he's like, yeah, I actually don't know. It's been so long since I went back and read the book that I look at the script and I don't know what I wrote and what you wrote, it's Bob. And I think that couldn't have been a bigger compliment, but it's quite true. I mean, Bob invented chunks of that fit in so seamlessly you'd never know it was Kurt or not. But I really like the film, and I appreciate your bringing it up. It's the only film left of mine that isn't either out or coming out on Blu-ray. So I really hope it finds that home one day, because I really was happy with the way we shot it and the way it looked, and it's a mix of black and white and color, and it would look so much better on Blu-ray. And so far, no one's ever done it. It's kind of been tied up, in a library, a film library. But I'm hoping. So
yeah, I know the Chocolate War is going to come out on Blu-ray, I think later this year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, early fall is what I'm hearing now.
Oh, good.
I mean, I've sort of signed. It's always a slow process, and especially since COVID, it's a slower process nowadays. But they got me a copy of the transfer to sign off on, and which I was quite happy with. I mean, it's an older transfer. It's the transfer we did back a few years ago, but I was happy with it at the time, and it was like, yeah, it still looks really good to me, and I feel like it gains a lot. That film is so visually dark. Intentionally, we were trying to we were really trying to get this kind of super dark, moody feel with a lot of it, and DVD just didn't handle that well. It got a little bit artifacty and strange and Black Crush looking, and so seeing it at a higher resolution, it definitely was like, oh, right, that's what it looked like when we shot it. So I'm happy that it's finally finding its way to being out there.
Yeah, and it's a killer soundtrack. Your needle drops are just impeccable in that film, and I almost feel like with your taste in music, we could do a whole separate podcast of our favorite needle drops in movies.
Oh, that'd be fun. We should do that sometime.
Yeah,
that'd be fun.
That would be fun, because I just want to hear your thoughts on music too. Because again, when I saw that film and heard the soundtrack, I was like, geez, this just sounds like a mixtape I made for somebody.
Well, it's funny because when I was falling in love with movies, two of my biggest influences were Scorsese and Kubrick, both of whom used a lot of source music.
Sure.
Often in lieu of any score at all. So I wanted to do that too, because I thought that was so cool and worked so well. So that's always been part of my mentality, because those are the heroes I grew up, and we all, whatever you do, you have people that you look at and go, oh, I want to do this the way they do it. And so that was a huge influence on me. I would go to their movies and be amazed by how they made music that wasn't designed for the film work so well for the film. And I really like that. I actually think needle drops done well, I feel like adds so much, because the very fact it wasn't designed for the film, and there's that slight tension between the music having its own identity and yet being part of the movie. I think when that works, it works great. It works better than any score. And when it doesn't work, it can be really clunky and embarrassing. We've all had those moments too.
Oh, for sure. And I know a lot of people cite, Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson as being masters of that as well, and rightfully so.
Oh, yeah.
I just, one of the more subtle ones is, well, not necessarily subtle, but just, it's not one that's always pointed out first when you think of Tarantino, but his use of the Delphonics in Jackie Brown is just perfect.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, you mentioned Scorsese, and he's going to come up probably in our conversation, maybe even with the first film we're going to talk about when we're talking about underrated films of the 60s. And you could probably also think of them as underappreciated of the time or underseen. They've definitely garnered quite a following from cinephiles, probably listeners of this podcast, and film scholars. So yes, we are going back to the 1960s, and I think much like our lineup for the 70s, this is an incredibly strong batch of titles we're going to talk about.
Yes. There's really only one that you and I both went, oh wow, on revisiting, maybe wasn't as strong as, and I was going to suggest it as we remembered. But most of them are, and even that has value.
Oh, for sure.
But the other 9 are all remarkable filmmaking with no caveat or no asterisk. And the thing I was saying to you before we started that really struck me on a personal level was many of these, for whatever reason, were films I haven't seen in 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. So I remembered them really fondly, but that memory was an older memory. And revisiting them, I was struck. And this is part of, I think, the artistic experience with everything. It can be a book, it could be a play, it could be a painting. Is how, as we change as people, as we age, and we go back to things, often our experience is so different. Yeah. So I didn't find myself not liking the films as much, or in some cases I liked them even more. But what seemed most important or most striking or whatever had definitely shifted on a good number of these. And that was really interesting to me, that there were films that were sadder or funnier or whatever than I had remembered them being. And I think that's part of what's so interesting about, and films particularly seem prone to that. I feel like because they're reflections of our times and our whatever, that when we go back as a different person, because time has passed, we just see different things. And so that was a really striking thing to me about this particular experience, even more than the other times that we've done this.
Yeah, I completely agree with that sentiment. And even our first title here, we're going to talk about Blast of Silence from 1961, Alan Barron. Kind of existential noir with a bit of a French New Wave sensibility. I think that, yes, European cinema was having an influence around this time. You know, even though, when I first saw this movie, I was really taken aback by the use of narration, and I think maybe I had just seen adaptation, and Brian Cox in that movie says, "And God help you if you use narration in your films. It's such a crutch." So when I first saw this movie, I was just like, "Yeah, this is a lot of wall-to-wall narration here. I don't know how I feel about it." Even though it's pretty cool, and especially now after a rewatch, I absolutely love the narration. It's incredible. It's written by Waldo Salt, and you have an incredible killer jazz score. This is, just and also an early example of just low-budget independent filmmaking that clearly went on to influence one Martin Scorsese. Yes. You can tell as you're watching it.
Well, and it's funny. To me, it seemed like it influenced Scorsese. It also seemed to be either influenced by or influencing of Cassavetes. Mm-hmm. Because he kind of had that. This also, even more than Scorsese, had a really improvisational feel to it, which is really interesting in a noir setting.
Yeah, no kidding.
But there's a lot of the scenes that feel like they could be in a Cassavetes movie. You feel like anything could happen, and the actors could sort of go off in any direction, which is it was just an interesting marriage of that style to what's normally a very stringently controlled sort of storytelling in terms of noir, and so it was very striking for that to me. I also, the thing about the narration that makes it for me so interesting is that a kind of narration that we almost never hear, which is second person narration.
Yes, good point.
All the narration is you feel this, you see this, you sense danger. And there's something very arresting about it. I mean, it's arresting because we're not used to it, but also it subtly, or maybe not so subtly, puts you inside you are the main character in a way.
Yes.
When the film is telling you, you do this, you feel this, there's something about that I think screws with your head a little bit while you're watching it in a really interesting way. And I liked it. And it's not something I remember seeing ever in another film. I'm sure somebody's done it. Everybody's done things more than, everything's been used more than once. But it's the only film I can remember that uses second person narration very intentionally and very heavily.
Yeah, that's a good call. I'd have to look up and see when and if that has been used before. I'm sure people know right off the top of their heads. But yeah, I think I first saw this and I was just like, this is really just off in this really interesting way. And probably because it was improvised, maybe I was expecting something a little more controlled, having seen the Fritz Lang world of noir and stuff like that. But yeah, his performance here is just so not very showy. It's more of an internal struggle about him not wanting to be this person that he's ultimately become.
Yes.
And whether it's due to being isolated for so long or he's just conditioned to be a hitman or a little bit of both, you really, the narration really puts you in his mindset in a way that gets you really involved and actually on edge when he's confronted by Big Ralph in that bathroom,
Yes. And it's funny because for all of it, I think you really nailed something too, is that it's so low key for a movie about violence and hitman, and it's his performance, but the whole feel of it has a kind of almost quietly depressed feeling to it.
Yeah.
Like it's a noir, thriller, but it's really not pushing for the thrills. It's really pushing for a quieter exploration of this guy's soul, which is really interesting. The action that is in it exists to. I mean, this is one of those films where I feel like the plot exists to examine the character, not the character exists to further the plot. And I think that's a really interesting thing when you see pieces where, yes, there's plot, but the plot's there so you can get inside this person's head.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think I'm more drawn to that over time, yeah, I guess, yeah, character studies, but just, focusing on the actors and, yeah, less about it being weighted down by a lot of plot points or a lot of twists or things that you come to expect something unexpected in a noir, especially when the way things play out in the third act. And when it doesn't necessarily, you kind of go, huh, does it end, more with a whimper than a bang? But I think it's effective. I mean, again, a lot of the films we're talking about too are a little fatalistic here and there in ways that surprised me for this era. And yeah, the way this ends, I think they were actually filming during like a crazy hurricane or something. At least the way things start out when he's walking on that beach.
There's definitely weather going on.
Oh yeah.
And it adds to, I mean, I'm just looking, I have I have my little notes that I take while I'm watching it. And one of the things I wrote was that how effectively depressing the photography is. Mm-hmm. Like, it's beautiful in the way it's shot. And it's very stark. But, lots of films are beautiful and stark. But there's something about this beautiful and stark that really created a mood for me. It, again, was more about the emotion than it was about tension. Like, often in noir, the shadows and everything are all about, ooh, it's scary. What's in those shadows?
Yeah.
And there are touches of that. But it really felt moody to me, the way the darkness of it didn't feel so much about what's going to jump out of the dark places. It's like, no, you're already inside this guy's dark places.
Yeah, and the fight he has with Big Ralph is really messy. Like, the confrontation they have does feel like exactly how it would play out in real life, as opposed to being really staged and choreographed. And I just think that whole sequence is beautifully shot. The whole movie is. And yeah, I'm not sure why it was like, it was pretty great. Not one of my favorites when I first saw it, but the more I see it, the more I'm like, wow, this is actually kind of a masterpiece, really.
Well, and that's a thing that I was saying too, is that, things just evolve when you go back to them. Mm-hmm. And that's what's cool about art. I mean, there's so many, I don't know, books that I've reread, at age 55 that I didn't get when I was 25, or things that when I was 25 I thought were masterpieces that now at 60 I'm like going, eh. I mean, it's just, and that's really, I think, one of the best things about art is that it sort of evolves as we evolve. It's not a fixed point. I really think art is an interaction between the audience and the piece of art. So even if the art hasn't changed, you have. So it's going to be a new experience. And I've definitely had that thing you're describing with films where I like them, and then I see them again later, like, how could I only have liked that? That's amazing. And I think some of that, that is, as you get older, you appreciate more things. You understand more things. Things speak more deeply to you. I had that, and we'll get it as we go through it, but a couple of these films I definitely found affected me on a more emotional level. Some of these were films that I really thought, oh, that was cool the way they were shot, or it was, and then now it's like, no, this is really moving. But I was too young, I think, with some of them to appreciate the loss or sadness that they carry.
Yeah, and I also feel like I'm becoming more sensitive with age. Like, I think that happens to a lot of people, but I mean, watching Starman on the big screen again, I was like kind of overwhelmed with emotion in a way that I probably wasn't when I first saw it when I was a kid, even though I did see it on the big screen. It's just amazing to me how over time I feel a lot more when it comes to watching a movie or listening to music too. So.
And I think that makes sense to me because, I mean, if you stay, I mean, I think a lot of people sadly close down emotionally as they get older, but if you don't, then as you get older, you've experienced more loss. Mm-hmm. You realize how temporary, when you're 25, life doesn't feel temporary. You kind of feel like you're going to live forever, and, regrets and things like that don't feel the same. I mean, you might have regrets in love that are so powerful, but the older you get and the more you go, oh, my time is limited, the more you really can reflect on, life is full of sadnesses and losses and people you loved who aren't here anymore, or things that you dreamed of that you didn't achieve, and you have to go, you know what, that's never going to happen. I had these dreams, and, I'm old enough that that's probably not going to be real. And I think that does, if you don't shut off from those things, I think your vulnerability and tenderness to the whole range of emotions is just higher. Having, in your case, having kids, whatever. I mean, a lot of things in the world open you up, I think, as time goes on.
Oh, yeah, again, eloquently put. as I struggle to say that. Eloquently put. It's a hard word to say sometimes. But you mentioned kids, so let's move on to The Innocents.
What a good segue.
Woohoo! Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Oh boy, Deborah Kerr in The Innocents, a movie I'm dying to see on a big screen. It is one of the most gorgeously shot films maybe ever. And yeah, watching even just the Criterion Blu-ray, I'm kind of floored by not just the cinematography, but the impeccable sound design, the choices throughout this film really is unnerving in ways that clearly, again, influence so many filmmakers to come when it comes to the horror genre, and how it plays more psychologically than let's do jump scares. I think that's what's really important. And obviously, this is based on Henry James's Turn of the Screw, and I know Mike Flanagan did a miniseries fairly recently that covers the same territory. But I haven't seen that yet, and I've been kind of interested in catching up with it now that I've just rewatched The Innocents, and also proclaim it now as one of my favorite horror films, one of my favorite haunted house films, maybe ever, I think. It should be right up there with The Haunting when people talk about this era of horror filmmaking, for sure.
Well, it's funny because for me, I've always been even loath to actually call it a horror film, because it really feels more like a psychological thriller.
Sure.
I mean, there are some horror tropes within it and horror setups within it, but it's really about psychology, and it's really about what's going on inside this woman's brain, much more than traditionally we think of horror as being. That's one of the things I like so much about it. This is one of those movies I've loved. I saw it when I was a kid, and I've loved it ever since, and it has not changed that much for me because I keep going back and seeing it and going, still love it. But it's funny. I've never found it really scary. I find it disturbing.
Yeah, unnerving.
It's scary. Yeah. It's like, and actually was something I thought runs through again a lot of the films we're going to be talking about today. I found Blast of Silence disturbing. And I definitely, The Innocents to me is a disturbing and thought-provoking movie, and it does feel uneasy to watch it, but it's not, in a world where people have grown up on jump scares and blood and gore, it's not scary in that way. It's the inference that's really deeply creepy, and the sexual inference with the kids, which was really ahead of its time and is pretty out there, and again very disturbing. I mean, that there's this kind of strange relationship between Deborah Kerr and that kid, that boy, where nothing happens, and it's why it's brilliant. Nothing we actually see, but there's certainly a sexual energy between her and this little boy who may or may not be the soul carrying the soul of an adult man. It's really just feels wrong in a really good way.
Oh, and that dream sequence too. I mean, this whole movie, it's about a mental collapse of sorts. It's about neuroses. It's about, just kind of forbidden desires, perhaps, or at least just the fact that she's experiencing all this while among children is very off-putting. It's really, again, I use the word unnerving quite a bit because I felt that way, and I felt that throughout, and also just kind of marveling at the compositions and just, certain shots of just when that figure of him appears in the window. Maybe I wouldn't necessarily lump this in as a horror film maybe along the lines of something like Rosemary's Baby, but still.
Yes, the more in that kind of, and I think most people would say it's horror. It's just, to me, I think horror became such a cliche that I tend to think of movies like this as psychological thrillers, even if they're supernatural elements, or in this case, one of the great things of the film is it's the question marks around the supernatural. What is and isn't going on is kind of the point of the movie. Is like, what's in her head, what isn't in her head, and there have been plenty of films that have played with that. Is is this subjective or objective? But this just does it incredibly well, and in a way where it's really disturbing either way. Like if she's making up 90% of this or only making up 10% of it, it's really disturbing.
Oh, that kiss! That kiss. Oof.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just bleh. God, it's great that way, and the imagery, you're right, is so beautiful. It's very specific. It's not just beautiful, but it's unlike, again, other films in that genre. It's much closer. I mean, the cinematography reminded me of Citizen Kane. It's that kind of really deep focus kind of thing, which is so interesting, where you've got somebody's face very large in the foreground and somebody far away in the background, and they're both very sharp. And it's a disturbing style of cinematography, but it's not one that I think of when I think of either horror or thrillers that often. I mean, horrors and thrillers often seem to rely on shallow focus. They seem to rely on, I can't really see what's back there, or I can't, and keeping figures very isolated in the frame. So to have a film where it's all about various literal levels of reality, there's somebody's 30 feet away from the camera, somebody else is 2 feet away from a camera, and yet they manage to light it and shoot it in a way where they're both sharp, is really interesting, because it kind of goes with that theme of, well, what reality are we watching here? And there's also something about when you see somebody's face in the foreground and then somebody far away in the background, that sort of implies that the far away person is in the head of the person close up to you.
Yeah.
It's not literal, but it kind of has that implication, as if you're seeing their memory in the same shot. And it wasn't something I had thought about before, but watching it this time, I thought, yeah, that's not a style I can think of many horror films using. And they use it very consistently. It's the whole film is shot with this very sort of deep focus feeling that I think is just both gorgeous and effective.
Yeah, there's like a kind of like a displaced subjectivity going on when she's looking in windows. Obviously you can think of it as a reflective surface and a mirroring of her psychosis and things like that. And wondering, yes, is what she's experiencing really happening, or is it all in her head? Is this a situation? Is this isolation creating these feelings in her? Again, like two movies in a row, I'm thinking a lot of movies, or a lot of favorite movies, are kind of about lonely people not knowing how to function in certain situations like this. Yes, she has some people around her, including kids, but she's clearly have gone through something, and that ending leaves a lot of questions, and we'll have that again later on with other films too. But I think
it's hard. I mean, some of these films are hard to talk about without being really spoiler heavy. I mean, it's tricky, because a lot of these films end up in places that you don't expect, and it's doing a disservice to people who might not have seen them to give away too much of that. But it's interesting, because a lot of these movies, you end up somewhere and go, wow, okay, didn't realize I was going to end up there. Right.
No, exactly. And I know, I think Clayton actually, sort of adapted this maybe from a play. And that was, on stage, more of a creaky melodrama that actually did feature ghosts grasping characters at certain points and sort of spelling it out more in a way that I think wouldn't work. And he decided to hire Truman Capote to adapt the screenplay, maybe make it a little bit more subtle and suggestive. And certainly the ambiguous ending is one that's going to haunt you.
Oh, yeah. No, I've noticed that a few of these films, one of the things that to me is always a signal that I have a connection to a movie is something very visceral. It's sort of that hair on the back of your neck feeling. I tend to feel it, though, in my jaw and my arms. It's kind of a goosebumpy, shivery sensation, along with a feeling of kind of unexplained emotion underneath. It means I'm really like being disturbed by, but also deeply into the film. And I had that with like half of the movies on this list, where I'm watching it, and even though I'd seen them before, some of them I'd seen many times before, I'm still getting that kind of literal shivery physical sensation that's like, just kind of creepy and kind of fascinating, but they're operating on a visceral level, even though they're very smart and intellectual movies. And I always think those are, like, to me, always my favorite movies and the most interesting films, is if a film can kind of get my brain and my gut at the same time. I think that's really amazing.
Yeah, I think if we had filmed this lineup, for like a film festival, I would feel better if we brought a therapist in the lobby to help the audience afterwards, because these things, they do seep into your subconscious. They do make you think a lot, and again, we mentioned that a lot, but those are my favorite types of movies too, for sure. The ones that don't leave you with easy answers at the end. And my mom's quite the opposite. She wants to know everything that's happened. She wants to know what happened to the killer, or did this really happen or not. I think she practically wants a psychiatrist at the end of Psycho explaining everything.
Well, and look, I think that's a very understandable human want.
Sure.
I think the frustration of that, though, is often what makes for great art.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think the fact that it is frustrating not to have answers is what makes something haunting. We all, on some very primal, young level, want somebody to say, "Here's what it is. She's crazy, or she's not crazy, or this incident is." I think wanting that is what makes not getting it effective. But sometimes I think with storytelling, that's the thing you have to remember, is that giving the audience what they want is actually sometimes a recipe for disaster. I remember somebody talking about that with some TV show that was all based on a will they, won't they romance. And it was hugely popular, and the second they finally got together, like, no one ever watched it again. As much as people had been saying, you can't just leave it dangling out there, it's like, once you give people an answer, they can put it away. And I find, even if a film's brilliantly made, if it's all too neat, I forget it much faster. 5 years later, I'm much more hard-pressed to remember it or have it show up in my brain unexpectedly. Whereas when I'm left with questions, it kind of haunts you. It becomes its own ghost because you don't have a neat way to put it away on a shelf.
There's a particular director who once said, "Don't look for explanations in my work," and that would be Louis Buñuel.
Yes. And another good segue.
Thank you. The Exterminating Angel from 1962. And I think Ebert said in his review that, Buñuel is this filmmaker who obsessively reworked the themes that they couldn't shake. These were the things that kept them up at night. And certainly, yes, someone like Hitchcock definitely went and revisited those themes time and time again, particularly voyeurism in his case. But yeah, this is a really fascinating film that, again, the first time I saw it, a lot of question marks hanging over my head in a good way. And revisiting it, this one too, it's, again, one of my favorites, although I gotta say, Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie is probably still my favorite. This is probably a close second to that.
Well, and the two of them definitely are definitely cousins,
yes,
in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I think probably quite intentionally, that in some ways, Discreet Charm, and it's exactly what you're saying about Ebert saying it. I mean, he is revisiting not only the themes, but in some ways even revisiting the story in those two movies. I mean, it's not exactly the same.
It's like a reversal, yeah.
Yes, but it's still about the affluent people and their relationship to being unable to get what they want. And I mean, it's definitely part of his kind of specific worldview. But it's really, I mean, they would be a great double feature because the two of them, do sort of play off each other.
Yeah, clearly classism. Yeah, he's really interested in
class. That. He was obsessed with class. He was obsessed with religion and the emptiness of religion and the promise religion would give of answers that it could never provide. And he had this dark sense of humor about wealth and class and society and religion and all the strictures that we live under. But what I love about Exterminating Angel and why it may even be my favorite Buñuel film, although often my favorite Buñuel film is whatever Buñuel film I watch.
Sure.
But for me, it's when you read reviews about it, whatever, people always talk about how funny it is, and it has a real mordant humor to it. Mm-hmm. But I find it more, again, these words, haunting and disturbing, and less funny than some of his other work.
I agree with that, yeah.
there are really funny elements or moments or lines or images, but it's also really sad. And I mean, these rich people are trapped in this room, and really the only surreal thing in this movie is the basic idea. The only surreal element is that it's a bunch of wealthy people going to a dinner party and unable to leave for no explicable reason. They just can't get themselves to walk out the door. And that's sort of magical and not real. But all the behavior beyond that is pretty rooted in naturalistic behavior. It might be exaggerated at times, whatever, but it's sort of like, okay, here's the surreal premise, and now we're going to watch it realistically. And I think in a lot of Buñuel's other movies, the premise is surreal, but so is the behavior, so is it. And I think it's a really interesting contrast in this movie that, like, yes, the setup is completely not real and absurdist and all that, but how they behave once they can't leave is kind of a little bit Lord of the Flies. I mean, so kind of a little bit rooted in really what happens when you lock a bunch of people in, in this case, a bunch of very self-involved, wealthy people. What happens when they can't get away from each other and can't go anywhere? And that to me is interesting because it's sort of simultaneously absurdist, but also very real.
It's funny, in my notes, I wrote down Lord of the Flies campfire at one point when they're setting up a fire in this luxurious setting. It's hard not to think of that. I also thought of I probably thought this when I first saw Darren Aronofsky's Mother not too long ago. I probably cited Buñuel when I was talking about it, just because like everything takes place in this one contained environment and chaos is happening all around and society is breaking down within this one place. Those types of scenarios really get to me. I don't have like a lot of phobias, but the idea of being trapped and not being able to leave something really gets to me. Really, yeah.
That's actually, I would not have thought of the Mother thing, but the second you said it, I was like, oh yeah. I mean, they're very different in style, but in terms of that claustrophobic breaking down of reality in an enclosed place, there's definitely a kinship there.
Oh, for sure. And I know some have cited this as like a critique of the post-Spanish Civil War rise in elitism, but I'm not as familiar with the historical side of things or, that context that he probably infused into this. I mean, you also mentioned religion and clearly how this movie ends. You can't help but laugh a little bit at the idea of sheep running into a church.
Yes.
And that's just, Buñuel is going to be Buñuel, and I accept that. But you're right in saying that there is a lot of sadness here in the fact that some of these people's behaviors, you see them, again, we probably will mention this in other films too, people having breakdowns and losing their identity and losing their sense of self is in of itself very sad to witness, even if these are bourgeois, privileged partygoers,
And what's masterful is he does keep a sense of humor. I mean,
right.
Because I think it would have been a terrible mistake to have gone full tilt drama. I mean, he still is always, Buñuel is always giving a playful wink. He's always, but he's sort of taking two seemingly paradoxically incompatible things, which is this very steely-eyed look at the darkness of the human soul, and then he's also kind of smiling and winking and nudging you in the ribs at the same time. And it's, in this film, to me particularly, like, it's amazing that he juggles both of those at once.
Yeah.
And somehow you can really sense the sadness and what wealth does to people and what status does to people and how these people have disconnected from their own humanity and all these very serious things, and yet just keep it funny enough and light enough that it doesn't feel good for you. It doesn't feel like I'm lecturing you about all these things. I'm just showing you these interesting, weird characters. But underneath, there's some really serious ideas, as absurd and funny as some of the moments are.
No, I agree completely with that. I mean, part of me wants to interpret this on on a Charlie Kaufman level of Buñuel is playing God in this scenario, and he's channeling his anger at all these characters by not allowing them to leave the film. Kind of like, what Chuck Jones did with that Daffy Duck cartoon, just manipulating his creation because he knows he can. But no, I think we've nailed this one pretty clearly. It's just, sort of roasting the political climate at the time, but also it's still eerie that it kind of plays true to how things are in the world, period. Not just of its time, I think.
No, oh, absolutely. No, and in fact, one of the interesting things about it is he actually shot it in Mexico, but it definitely feels like it's about Europe.
Right.
I mean, Mexico doesn't really have some of that history of the same sort of history of an established upper class and, it's kind of gigantic ancient houses. And so it was funny because it was during that Mexican period where he mostly was working there. But, I didn't realize that until watching it this time and then trying to read a little about it. I just assumed it was shot in Spain because it definitely feels like it's much more about a certain old European money decadence than it is about a new world form of decadence.
Yeah, and I definitely want to see more Buñuel. I think I've only seen 4 of his movies, and this just, when you watch one of his movies, you kind of want to explore it and see these themes redone in different ways throughout his career. He's definitely one director I'm going to cover on this podcast, which I'm surprised I haven't yet. This is a masterpiece too.
It's remarkable in that he's so damn entertaining, and yet at the same time so full of ideas and thought, and but he's very devilish, he's very playful, and his range is spectacular. I mean, I just rewatched Los Olvidados, the Damned, his film from 1950, which is flat out neo-realistic drama. Nothing weird, nothing. I mean, it is just like, there's 1 or 2 dream sequences, but the film itself is this gritty, realistic street drama. And just realizing that's the same guy as was then, not that many years later, making Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie or Obscure Object of Desire, or it's really amazing. More than most directors, he had an incredible range of tones, and especially given, as everybody does point out correctly, he had a lot of obsessive things within his movies. I mean, mistrust of religion or whatever, but how that was expressed over the course of his career was just remarkable in its breadth of ways of approaching those ideas.
Yeah, and managing to retain a visceral intensity at times, and these what these characters experience and their personal anxieties, you actually do feel for them as opposed to demonize them, Which
is a really good point, because it would have been very easy to turn them just into cartoons.
Right.
Which would have just worn out its welcome, I think. You would have gotten it, and you would have gone, yeah, they're shallow and venal, and, and yet, if that was all they were, you'd get it. You'd say, okay, got it. Don't need to finish the rest of it. But because these people still have humanity, and they're trying to find ways to reconnect or cover up or deal with that humanity, it does mean you can sort of despise them in a way and identify with them at the same time, which is always really interesting.
Yeah, when directors can do that, I'm kind of in awe, because you're right, it's so easy to do just completely make the characters one thing and one thing only, as opposed to make them fully dimensional human beings. The next film is a really challenging one to talk about for obvious reasons, but a lot of people would eventually sort of, consider an actor like William Shatner to stay in one lane after he became known as Captain Kirk. But he's had some interesting performances here and there, and I'm not sure if there's ever been a more chilling performance that he's given than in The Intruder from 1962, a film by Roger Corman.
Which blew my mind.
I'm sure.
It is talk about not playing the type. This was not a film I'd ever seen, and I thank you for turning me on to it, because I didn't even know about it, which is pretty weird, because I feel like I know about most movies, even if I haven't seen it. I'd never heard of it. And then when I did hear about it, and it's like Roger Corman and William Shatner in a movie about like racial strife, it's like, oh my God, that's going to be so embarrassing. And it ain't. It's powerful and honest and political and complicated, and like has nothing to do with exploitation or any of the things that we associate with Corman. Mm-hmm. And Shatner is sort of, for the most part, pretty subtle. I mean, he's somebody that has sort of in some ways become a joke of like, oh, he's so big and over the top. And he has a couple of over the top moments in the movie, but there's a lot of subtlety in the part that he plays, and so I was delighted that you suggested this because I was, to me, it was a complete discovery.
Well, it was for me too when I was exploring, the films that Roger Corman had made, because this really stood out, like you mentioned, and was completely unexpected for me. And yet there was a downside to his ambition to create this socially relevant and provocative film, because even at just a cost of like $80,000, it lost money. And it was the first and maybe only Corman film to do so. No one wanted to distribute it. It did receive a lot of acclaim from critics and people who saw it, but no, I mean, this actually really bummed out everybody involved because they put so much into this story, and I don't think audiences were ready for it. I don't know if, they had certain expectations going in, but yeah, it's
well, and I don't know how much audiences would even be ready for it today, which is why it's an interesting movie. I mean, you open the film with this bunch of very nice-seeming white people, like mostly older, like charming, sweet little old grandmas and up, who start throwing around the N-word and horrible racist comments and cliches, and it's like, whoa, what am I in the middle of? And it's really disturbing. I mean, by about 3 minutes in, you're like, holy crap, what is this? And it's probably what it is a very honest portrait of a level of racism and anger and hatred that was very much a part of the South. Well, it's been part of American history in general, South history in particular. And this was around the moment of forced integration of schools. And it brought out a lot of the worst of people that they normally might keep a tiny bit hidden. And at this point in this town, it's no longer even trying to be hidden. And it's really disturbing because it's the casual racism. Like, we've all seen lots of Hollywood movies where there's the bad racist Southern. Mm-hmm. This is a movie where it's the town, and it's the sweet little old lady who owns the supermarket. And it's, and that, I think, is an honesty about America that you don't see even now in movies very much. We really like to unintentionally make a pun, segregate racists. We like, oh, they're the really horrible, big, tough-looking guy, who is the one bad guy in town. As opposed to, no, it's kind of like everybody in town. Yeah. And that, I think, is a very unusual thing in an American film.
Yeah, it treats racism as this virus that has completely infected this entire community in town. And here comes Adam Kramer, played by William Shatner, to sort of, light a match under this fire and sort of just, I don't like movies about this level of manipulation, where somebody comes in and is just like, I am pure chaos. I am, that's kind of what people talk about when they think of Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker in The Dark Knight, is that I'm just here to fuck things up just because I can.
Right.
And that just automatically sends chills down my spine. His performances in this was completely unexpected and horrible and disturbing on so many levels. And Corman shot all of the long shots with Shatner delivering those speeches. He added a lot of the dialogue in post-production so the crowd had no idea what he was saying. I mean, so there's like this weird disconnect at times. He tells these stories about how, like, basically he would have been run out of town because they shot in a real southern town, and a lot of the people in small parts are real people from the town, and they look like scary people who might be in the Ku Klux Klan. And so he basically created a false movie so that he could make the movie and not get killed. And so, he would dub in speeches for Shatner later, and you see why when you see it, because it's really out there. I mean, one thing that bothered me a bit, I was torn. At times I liked it, at times I didn't. There's tremendous ambiguity about what Shatner's trying to accomplish. And while I'm normally a fan of ambiguity, I did feel like in this case, I wish I had a little more insight into beyond just I want to create chaos. Mm-hmm. Because unlike the Joker, he seems like a very real human being. And it seems like he's come to this town with a very real agenda. But given that the town is already violently racist and seems, like it's not his fault the town's racist. The town's racist. I wished I had a little more sense of
he clearly wants to accumulate power. He clearly wants to put himself in that position of, but I wasn't quite sure watching the film to what end.
Right.
And
I think even a character asks him outright maybe later on, like what is the point to doing this maybe, but I don't think there really is that answer.
Yeah, and normally that doesn't bother me. Normally I love that ambiguity. In this case, it at moments felt like a cop-out to me, although at other moments it felt like, oh, that's just what makes it interesting. But I also felt a little bit towards the end that the film was leaning a little bit more on the, oh, Shatner's the problem, not the town. And what I loved for a lot of it was, no, the problem's the town. Shatner happens to be there to exploit it, but this town, this town had cross burnings and people throwing around the N-word, and it was completely segregated and had racial violence. All that was there before Shatner got there.
Right.
He tries to focus it. But I feel like towards the end of the movie, there's a little bit of a feeling of, oh, it's Shatner's fault. And I felt like, oh, don't go there, because you've been so brave, and don't turn it into the more traditional, he's the problem. Because for 2/3 of the movie, certainly it's very clear that he ain't the problem. He's just profiting from the problem.
I think that you're right. There is kind of a conflicting message there towards the end. I guess I found it interesting that that's what the town ultimately decides, like, oh, we aren't the problem. It's this, we need a scapegoat. It's this guy. He clearly has enforced all of these beliefs we've had in a way that's, completely out of hand. I mean, and it's kind of a confused message and ending overall, and maybe it could have been expanded just a little bit further to really, bring it home.
Feels like it pulls its punches a bit. I mean, I feel like the movie. I mean, I feel like the movie should have, in a real world, the movie would have ended in a darker place. I don't think it would have resolved as it was.
Right.
And I think it only bothers me in the sense that the film is so shockingly honest for so long, and unlike almost every American film from the era, but even since, dealing with racism, that feel often dishonest and try to it's like, yeah, those occasional bad people who are as opposed to, no, it was the system. Mm-hmm. It was the country was racist, not like two people. It was like, and so to see a film that was so bold, I felt a little frustrated by the ending, but I do think you raise a very interesting point. And when I hadn't thought of it, makes me want to go back and look at the film again, which is some of that the town trying to put off its own guilt on this stranger.
That's what I'm thinking.
But if the town is doing it and not the film, I actually feel very differently about it, because that to me is very interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if the film supports that or not. It could be, again, me projecting a little bit, or at least hoping that's the case. But yeah, it's again one of those visceral experiences where you just feel completely uncomfortable throughout the whole film, in a way that's also incredibly sad, because this still happens. And I've seen it. So.
Yeah, no, we like to feel we've come way further on this than, I mean, yes, I feel like we've covered up some of the most obvious racism in America somewhat, although I certainly think the Trump era has given people the freedom to start voicing that stuff more viciously and openly again. But I don't think the underlying obsession with making people of color the other and the threat and the problem has ever gone away in America. And I think it's a big part of our history and how our culture, what it grew out of. I mean, you don't start a country with slavery as sort of the basis of how you gain most of your wealth and end up having not having that have reverberations throughout the rest of your history. And I feel like we've never fully dealt with that and examined that and examined all the subtle ways it's permeated so many things in the culture. Yeah,
no, that's very true. And those ideas will come up later, including in our next film, in a very, very provocative and interesting way that, again, I'm still floored by. Shock Corridor from Samuel Fuller, a film that I first saw as a psychology undergrad student.
That is cool.
Sort of thinking like, all right, I guess I have to analyze the portrayal of mental health in this, and the institution that he's in, as opposed to looking at it as like a B picture, because Samuel Fuller was kind of known for doing those types of stories here. And there are moments of that where it's like, yeah, this feels kind of, exploitive and creepy and wrong in some ways.
I think it can feel cheesy in moments, and
It's what I'm conflicted about. A little conflicted about more, despite, yes, I do love it.
Yeah. Well, I think, part of what Fuller does, kind of, Gene, is he is making a B movie. It's lurid. It's, it's the plot is really clunky and obvious, and we've seen it a million times before in sense, newsman goes undercover in dangerous situation. I mean, that's been done 8 trillion times.
Ace in the Hole, which we could always talk about for another decade.
Yes, great film.
Yeah.
But what Fuller does, there are two things he does, I think, that make this into a minor classic. One is that he has a sense of humor about the fact that he's making a lurid B movie, and doesn't, like he knows how over the top some of this is. When you've got the main character stumbling, who's like a reporter pretending to be crazy, stumbling into a room full of attractive young women who all start closing in on him like lionesses hunting a kill, and we hear the voiceover in the soundtrack going, "Nymphos." It's funny. I mean, you can't tell me for a second that Fuller, who's a really smart guy, didn't know how completely over the top and goddamn funny that is. I mean, it's sort of announcing this is a B movie. We're not.
Yeah, I'm gonna side on the fact that I think people today will look at that and find it troublesome. I don't know. I see the humor,
and perhaps rightly so. I mean, it is. I mean, the whole idea of that was a thing that women were, although it was starting to fade already by the early 60s, but it was still there. But the idea that, women who liked sex were mentally ill, and that nymphomania was this term thrown around for, and the idea that, but the way it's played out in this movie, where it's so funny and it's being so literal that they're literally attacking him and essentially, ripping his clothes off. I think even in 63, that would have been seen, I think. I mean, I was 2 years old in 63, so what do I know? But I can only imagine that would have been seen as somewhat ridiculously over the top, even at the time. I could be wrong, but so you've got that side of it. And then you've got the fact that he's, while the plot and all that stuff is cliche, and the specifics and the detail with which he examines those cliches are so brilliant and cool and political. And yes, tie into the last film, there's a lot of stuff about racism in the movie. There's a lot of, it's, he takes this very kind of, he takes a B movie and he makes it about a lot of important things and makes it really thought-provoking while it's still being a B movie.
Yeah. I mean, all the characters here are wild and outlandish in ways that, I could see some people, especially through today's lens, going, yeah, I mean, this isn't the best portrayal of people who are experiencing psychosis. And I sort of filter that through my own lens and go, well, yeah, it was a different time and this film was made during that time. And to me, it can feel like tonal whiplash in ways that can make you cringe, but I still think the overall effect is very strong. I mean, the Harry Rhodes in the role of Trent, the white supremacist that happens to be black, all of those scenes are incredible. That's the
one that really, I think, stands out.
Yeah.
It's full of amazing things, but the sequence where there's this young black man who's been so traumatized by his experiences with racism that he kind of basically has the psychosis that he is a white member of the Ku Klux Klan is pretty potent stuff. And again, just like with The Intruder, it's still pretty potent stuff.
Yes.
It's not like, when he starts talking about his feelings and it's not like, oh yeah, that was another time and place. It's like, holy crap, this is like completely relevant right now. And the film has a lot of things like that, whether it's, the atom bomb scientist who, it's all these people who faced this kind of trauma of what's wrong with society, trying to escape. And that's a pretty sophisticated idea in a movie that pretends to be, the bottom half of a double bill at your local drive-in.
Yeah, and I think, rather than leaving the audience with any sort of concrete conclusion, he sort of insinuates this, like, cyclical nature of systems in place, and that could include just the way that environment is set up, and it doesn't necessarily allow for people to get better. It just sort of allows them to cope with who they are in a way, even if they're still unwell for the most part. I think it's it's kind of a challenging ending once again. I mean, there's also those sequences too that are a little off, those fantasy sequences that are shot in color and they look like stock footage.
Yes.
That's kind of like, that's a little jarring to just throw in there here and there. But, he was a provocateur for a time when audiences were definitely not prepared for this kind of experience. But in hindsight, I think a lot of people go back and look at his work and just go, yeah, he was onto something in a lot of ways in terms of his social critiques.
So his social critiques and his filmmaking style. I mean,
right.
I don't know that the black and white color thing completely works. I think I read somewhere that was actually footage that he had taken, but not for the intention of use of this in this film, from his own travels, and that he basically thought it would be cool to then use it as like sort of a way of being inside people's heads. That, but I don't know that completely works, but it's certainly bold. And the sort of hallucinatory nature of some of the images, the indoor rainstorm, those are he was being very, very bold as a filmmaker, and doing it within the context of a B movie, and he did that at other times in his career too, and Corman had some of that, but to me Fuller was even operating on a higher level of sophistication in terms of political ideas and sophistication in terms of filmmaking, within being very cheesy. And so it's like, in some ways the film falls short, and certainly it's dated, although to me it's less dated again because of that sense of humor. Like, sure. If it took itself super seriously, I feel like I would be far more like, oh, I'm not comfortable with the way this is treating mental illness. I'm not comfortable with the way it's treating women. I'm not comfortable with the way it's... But because it's so clearly saying, I'm making a B movie here, so I'm winking at you, but I'm also asking a lot of really important questions. To me, I find, for me at least, I'm much more able to forgive him where the film does feel dated and even politically questionable in terms of its sort of inferences about society.
No, that's a great point. Again, like sometimes I feel like some movies you feel like you're in a bumper car, and it's just like, ooh, this is a lot to take when you have different. Yeah, you have the dark humor mixing in with the political subtext or whatever, and you kind of want it to just be consistent, but not all films are, because hey, life isn't consistent, and you have different feelings at different times. But this one is always stuck out to me as being a clear influence for a film that I absolutely love more and more, and it's Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island. I absolutely adore that film, and it's a film that a lot of people kind of go, doesn't quite work for me. But another film about trauma and how somebody who's dealing with it. And I know
that Scorsese was a huge Fuller fan, so I'm sure that was had an influence.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I think there's even an indoor rain sequence moment in Shutter Island. Actually, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's turned into one of my favorites over the years. So we got to get to one that we're a little mixed on.
Yes.
More than
this
than
was
most.
My fault because I remembered it differently than this was like literally like seeing it 35, 40 years later and going, oh. Yeah, not what I remembered completely.
Well, yeah, and once again, watching this one, I couldn't help but, yes, the influence of European cinema is definitely trickling into mainstream Hollywood productions, more so than ever, especially here. And, yeah, we have the delightful and charming Warren Beatty playing a successful comedian, but he's quite confused and neurotic at the same time. And is he suffering from a persecution complex of sorts? Like, is someone or something, an external force out there threatening him? Or, are they really after him, or is he just paranoid? That's kind of what the whole film
Yes.
is circling around. But I think this is a fascinating film that doesn't.
Oh, by the way, just you should just probably identify, because I don't think we ever actually said.
Mickey 1 from 1965, and a really powerful, interesting film that doesn't entirely work at the same time.
Yes.
So it does feel like it's all over the map. Director Arthur Penn would obviously go on to great success with Warren Beatty years later for obviously a film that was groundbreaking in a lot of ways and changed the face of cinema for years to come. But this one could have been a dry run of sorts, or it doesn't entirely work, but I think people should still see it, especially for a couple of really great sequences. When he first jumps aboard, jumps from the train and enters the Chicago junkyard, I think that whole sequence is really cool. And when he's forced to audition in this empty auditorium surrounded by this black void, and all he has is this spotlight and this ominous voice out there somewhere. That whole sequence is pretty incredible too.
That, to me, that's the part I remembered when I said, there's this great movie we should see. That sequence is just fantastic, because he's alone on stage, the spotlight's in his eyes, this voice is out there, and he's paranoid, but we have every reason to think he might be right, that there's going to be a shot's going to ring out any second. He's up there trying to tell gags, and he's pretty convinced, and we're not unconvinced, that they brought him there to kill him. And it's a very weird but very powerful sequence, both in this concept, but the way it's executed is beautiful, the way it's shot, the tension level is insanely high. And that sequence alone, I think, it makes the film worth seeing if you're just interested in filmmaking. And it's an amazing piece of filmmaking.
Yeah, those moments in particular, and I mean, come on, Warren Beatty has a screen presence. He carries the thing because he's Warren Beatty, and he's channeling a little James Dean or Brando here and there. At the time, he was most known for something like Splendor in the Grass, and to sort of lead, his charisma in this sort of flashy tribute to French New Wave, film noir, and maybe a little Kafka to throw in there.
Definitely. I wrote down Godard, Truffaut, Art, Kafka.
Yep. Very true. Very true.
But it's funny because it does feel a bit like a young filmmaker, and in Beatty's case, a young-ish producer actor doing those things.
Yes.
It feels a bit of like an imitation of, as opposed to a leaping off from Godard, Truffaut, and Kafka. It feels a little sophomoric now, looking at it again. Some of the ambiguity feels a little forced. It feels like, I think the thing about the new wave filmmakers, that was second nature. It was actually the way they saw the world. Mm-hmm. With this movie, I feel a little bit like somebody trying to do something cool they saw somebody else do.
Yeah, it didn't come across as completely natural. It felt a little forced and kind of, I don't know, self-aware about what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of very heavy-handed symbols.
Yeah.
And, you kind of go, oh my God, yeah, I got it. And there are other times where you go like, okay, I don't get it. What are you trying to do here? What is this? But it's always interesting. Even when it doesn't work, it's like not a film that bored me at all. I thought like certain things were a little cringy, like, oh yeah, that feels like a bit like somebody's thesis movie that they made.
Yeah.
But there's other moments that are spectacularly great. And like I say, it's never boring. It's beautifully shot. I think it really captures something about urban jungles in its cinematography. I love the opening shot of it. I think is great. Mm-hmm. There's this, the opening, which is Beatty sitting in a steam room, completely dressed in a bowler hat, surrounded by these creepy old white guys who all look like mob members, laughing at him, but sort of, it's as if it's sort of like maybe like some symbol of how he sees his comic life.
Sure.
That like he makes these people laugh, but the people he makes laugh are kind of horrifying and like, oh my God, I'm spending my life, trying to please these kind of fat, creepy old rich white dudes who like will kill me in a second, whether literally or figuratively. Um, so I mean, it's interesting. It's just somehow it didn't all add up the way I remembered from when I saw it. God knows how old I was, in my early 20s, maybe. I don't know. I remember thinking, oh, how profound. And now I kind of go, well, okay, maybe not as profound as I thought.
Yeah, I wish I cared more about his character in general. Like, I wish I had kind of an emotional response to whether or not he lives or dies, or, being at least empathic towards his, neuroses, and just kind of like going, oh, poor guy. I just felt, again, like that disconnect, even though I'm like, yes, it's Warren Beatty. Of course I'm going to watch him do anything, and the cinematography in this is pretty remarkable. This was made at a time in Chicago history when Richard J. Daley was very resistant to having movies produced and filmed here. So I wonder if that had something to do with the production, like feeling a little off at times. And it also makes that final shot kind of profound in its own way. I do love the opening, like you mentioned. It almost made me think of something the Coen brothers might have done.
Yes.
And here that final shot, it's like, yeah, I wish you could have found a lot more substance and less of the style to really accompany everything. But no, there are moments, and certainly as someone who lives in Chicago, it's a great film at times.
It is a portrait of Chicago that I think maybe because of Daley, we don't have those cinema portraits of Chicago from that era that much.
Right.
A lot of films shot in New York, a lot of films shot in other places, but Chicago, which is one of the most interesting looking cities in America, kind of is really underrepresented. And I'd forgotten the thing about Daley, but it is something I'd heard that there was not a lot of friendliness to film production, and that was too bad. And it's funny because I do think you could see this as a dry run for Bonnie and Clyde, which was just like 2 years later. And by that point, they found, I feel like, Arthur Penn and Beatty as a team did find their own voice.
Yes.
They and maybe they needed to do the film where they were imitating their heroes rather than doing their own thing. Like they needed to go through that to then on the next time out go, okay, we're not imitating anybody. We're doing something that's completely ours.
Yeah, that's a great point. I like it, and certainly people even feel that way with, Paul Thomas Anderson. He went from imitating his heroes like Altman and Scorsese to eventually finding his own voice.
Yes.
I
think that's true. Look, many, many, many great filmmakers don't start as great filmmakers with their first film. Some do, but a lot of people have to kind of feel their way a little bit before they can really break out with what's inside them.
That's a great point. I believe our next director for the film Seconds from 1966 had made another masterpiece before this one, called The Manchurian Candidate, of course.
Yes.
But, wow, this movie to me is never going to leave my brain. It's unbelievably dark and sad, and again, I just take a drink, folks. I'm going to say the word unnerving. And this is like the epitome of unnerving from just the opening cinematography. Like the cinematography in this is just unlike anything. James Wong Howe is like, he should have just won every award imaginable, because I think they were doing things with the camera that may haven't been done before. Not
outside of purely experimental films.
Yeah.
This was the first taking of fisheye lenses. There were all sorts of techniques that sure people had experimented with, in 3-minute shorts or whatever, but building into a Hollywood movie. A Hollywood movie with Rock Hudson in it. If you put this movie out today, people would be freaked out by the cinematography. People would go like, "Oh my God, it's one of the best shot films of the year." And it has lost nothing in 55 years in terms of its visual power and uniqueness. I've never seen a film that looked like it before or since. I've seen films that have stolen a given image here or there, but it is a unique technical piece of filmmaking, and then it's spectacular on a storytelling level.
Yeah, I remember when I first saw, like the work of Spike Lee, particularly Do the Right Thing, I was always thinking like, he must have invented the body mounted camera, right? And the shots that look like they're on a Segway or something, you know? No, I think they were originated before that.
Yeah, this is full of techniques that you may have seen since, but when you realize that nobody had ever seen them in a movie with a major Hollywood star before this movie.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just also a tonal thing. I mean, to me, this is David Lynch 20 years before David Lynch made a movie.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there are so many scenes in this that are deeply creepy, and it's a mix. It's cinematography, but it's also performance, writing, ideas. There's some of the scenes with Will Geer that are just, I mean, yeah, it is one of the most visually disturbing films I've ever seen. I mean, it creeps you out from beginning to end, but there's a lot more than just creeping you out going on. I mean, yes, that is, but it's also very political. It's also saying things about men and middle age. And this is a film I definitely understand at age 60 way, way more than I did at age 30. Because it's a film about grief of disappointment. It's a film about opportunities lost. It's a film about dreams that you'll never find. And so it's got a terrible sadness along with being one of the most effective paranoid thrillers ever, ever, ever made. I mean, without giving away anything specific, it has maybe the most disturbing last 5 minutes of any movie I've seen, period, ever. And that's a lot to jam into one movie.
Yeah, and I definitely think this is one that a lot of listeners have probably sought out just because I'm pretty sure I've brought it up, even just within the past 10 or 12 years when I first saw it, I probably freaked out and just went, this is pure nightmare fuel, and I want you to see it right away, people. Because, again, it does have those themes of, suburban materialism, and you said the, middle-aged midlife crisis for men, and just the struggle for an assured identity at a time when there is rapid change and clashing ideologies and sexual liberation and grape stomping, which that whole sequence is insane.
And we still, 55 years later, we're still in a country where we grow up largely to fulfill roles that we're told we're supposed to, right, and that a certain kind of affluence and success should make us happy. And then we get to some point in our life, often late in our lives, where we go, holy shit, I got those things, and I kind of want to kill myself. And I think that sort of desperate ennui has not changed all that much. I think a lot of surface things have changed, but I think, I think it was a problem that primarily men faced at that time because men were more of the workforce. I think now it's men and women much more equally. Mm-hmm. But that fact that there comes a point in your life that you look at all the things you've acquired and the bank account you acquired and the family you've put together because you're supposed to have this kind of a family, and you suddenly go, none of it means anything to me. And then the film spins off of that to say, well, okay, then what if there was a company that let you be reborn and let you have a major plastic surgery and a new identity created and a false death created so you could be reborn? And yet, while that sounds like it could be like a mediocre TV series, by approaching it with the kind of intelligence and complexity and visual brilliance and subtlety of writing and subtlety of performance, I mean, the whole film is full of some of the best New York theater actors of that time. Who were not widely known to movie audiences, but were spectacular actors. It takes this kind of somewhat obvious idea and takes you someplace that you just do not think you're going to end up.
Yeah, it made me think of that. One of the saddest lyrics I ever heard from one of my favorite records, Wilco's Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, is the line, "I know I would die if I could come back new." And this movie really takes that literally and almost turns into a Twilight Zone episode, but done incredibly well with so much layers that, yes, if you want to just look at this as like a, sci-fi horror experience, you can look at it that way. It works on just that simplest of levels. But yeah, there is so much going on underneath the surface in this film, and it feels like this came out at a time too when people were probably like, I'm here to escape reality.
Yes.
I'm not ready for this.
Yeah. That's a good point, and it's probably why I don't think the film did commercially all that well, because I don't know that people wanted to deal with that.
They probably didn't want to see Rock Hudson in this kind of role. That's for sure.
Yes, yeah. Well, and that's what is so interesting. I mean, the use of Hudson, and I'm sure that's probably part of what helped them get the financing. But he's not the obvious guy for this. But I think it's actually one of his very best performances.
I agree.
I mean, he's one of the things that really struck me rewatching it was how good and subtle he is. And like I say, he's surrounded by, people like John Randolph, who plays the before version of him, and Marie Hamilton and Jeff Corey. I mean, all these like really world-class, brilliant actors. And he really holds his own with them. You don't feel like, oh, he's the star guy that they threw in. And I think very much to his credit, or Frankenheimer's credit in working with him, there's a subtlety in the pain that Rock Hudson carries with him in the film that I don't associate with him as an actor. I mean, I think he's a fine sort of movie star screen presence, but this was like, whoa, there's a lot more going on in this performance than you think of with him.
Yeah, I agree, and he really dedicated himself to it. I know people sort of frown upon the method acting approach, but hey, he played some scenes actually drunk and remained that way for 3 days to film that party sequence.
Wow, I didn't know that, but that kind of makes sense, and it's amazing. I mean, I wonder if what we're seeing, and this is projecting into somebody else's psychology, but being gay at a time where it would have been the death of his career if people knew outside of a very small coterie of people in Hollywood, that sense of feeling like an outsider in your own skin, that sense of feeling like you have to hide in plain sight. I mean, a lot of the things that are themes in this movie, I wonder if connected deeply for him because of his own real life.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah. That adds a whole other level to that movie. That one struck me watching it this time of like, oh my God, this is a whole film about a man trying to pretend to be somebody else so that he can be seen as desirable and successful and accepted. And what an interesting thing for Rock Hudson to be making a movie about how that fails. Yeah, no, I guess it does feel like a very personal film for probably everybody involved, and yet it's very human and very sad and shocking and all the things you want from a challenging but ultimately rewarding experience. That again, use the word existential quite a bit, but here I think it's quite apt when you think of some of the scenarios presented in a lot of existential writing.
Yes, no, this is
what is self
an existential movie.
Yeah. Why don't you lead the conversation for our next one, because it was one that you brought up to me that I'm surprised I haven't heard of or seen before myself. Talk a little bit about The Incident from 1967. When did you first see it?
I first saw it in a very, I'm sure, edited version on late night TV as a kid in New York. That was, I mean, I'm old enough that a lot of the films I was exposed to, I was before the era of VHS even, much less DVD or, I wasn't from a time where you could pick and choose what movies you'd see. There was a couple of revival houses and, maybe a movie you're interested in would show up one year, maybe it wouldn't. So a lot of my early film going was turning on my 12-inch black and white television, at 1 a.m. when my parents were asleep and I couldn't sleep. And this was one of the movies I saw that way. And I'm sure it was probably chopped up and bowdlerized, and I was seeing it in an awful way on a 12-inch screen. And, but luckily it was black and white, so at least that was correct. But I remember being really freaked out by it and chilled by it and moved by it. And seeing it now, it's like, yeah, there are flaws. There are definitely places where basically the story is a very simple concept. And it's from a play.
That's what I thought. Yep.
Which you can tell at times, which is where it's a little bit the weaknesses can be. Mm-hmm. Two kind of punky young guys, but violent punky young guys, get on a New York City subway train deep in the night. It's like 2:30 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and proceed to terrorize everybody on the train, but confronting each of them with their own humanity. I mean, which is a very theatrical conceit. I mean, they don't just get on the train and start punching people and stealing their money. Each character they kind of take down on their own terms. But what I appreciate of the film is it acknowledges the theatrical conceit. It's not trying to. I think the film isn't trying to pretend it's naturalistic real life. It's kind of going, this is a metaphoric story, and we're not, we're using this as a chance to examine human behavior. We're not saying this is exactly what it would be like if these guys really did this.
Yeah, it's very heightened in that way, right?
And I think a lot of credit goes, because the writing can be clunky, but it can also be brilliant. I mean, it kind of has a mix. There are scenes that are super powerful, and there are scenes that are like a little like, okay, that's too on the nose. But some of the performances are really spectacular. Tony Musante and a very young Martin Sheen are the punks, and I think both of them are great.
Tony Musante is someone I'm like, he should have been huge. He is phenomenal in this movie.
Yeah. I mean, because he's a completely despicable, horrible human being, terrorizing a bunch of people on a train, and yet you have moments of empathy with him. And yet, at times, when he's bringing somebody, excuse me, when he's bringing somebody down for their own hypocrisy or whatever, in spite of your hating him, you get the point he's making. And it's a really hard role in that sense, because if he's not really awful, I mean, really terrible, the film doesn't work. But if you dismiss him as a monster, not a human being only, the film also doesn't work. And he is really disturbing in the movie. He's scary. He's surprising. You don't know what he's going to do next. So you're in that same position as all the people in that subway car of like, is he going to pull out a gun and just kill somebody? Is he going to say, okay, good night, everybody, and walk off the train? You just don't know what's coming. And it's a really galvanizing performance. And Martin Sheen keeps up with him in a quieter way. He kind of plays his sort of, slightly quieter wingman, right. Who goes along. Mm-hmm. But then some of the other performances, like Brock Peters is amazing in the movie. He plays this black guy who understandably hates white people, but so much that he's lost touch with his own humanity. And that's a really complicated character. Beau Bridges is in it. He's great. He plays this like Southern soldier who's and he's got a broken arm, so he's kind of vulnerable physically. But, he's also, young and strong, and he's looking at these two guys going, do I get involved? Do I not get involved? Where's the limit? What's the point? So these wonderful performances really take it up a level. And then I also think Larry Pierce's direction does, because he kind of does, again, to go back to Blast Sound, there's a semi-improvisational feel to a lot of it, which apparently from what I can read about it, actually a lot of stuff was sort of improvised. And that really helps. Between that and the cinematography that has a kind of jittery, Cassavetes-ish sort of feel to it, really helps offset the theatricality of it. If you'd shot it in a more straightforward, classic way, I think it would have felt unbearably like, oh, we're watching a film play. But because it kind of feels like you're watching a documentary, where the dialogue is more theatrical, there's a contrast there, and I think that really, really helps it work.
Yeah, the cinematography from Gerald Hirschfield, who would go on to shoot Young Frankenstein, very different movie, but incredibly well shot. Yeah, you mentioned it having a documentary, almost cinema verite feel, and yet there's like that heightened pulp novel kind of quality to the dialogue, and yet somehow it all works, without feeling like tonal whiplash in a way that, other films can. So I mean, I could see why this was a play, and I could see it being very effective as a play, and it's just so uncomfortable to watch and experience, and yet you put yourself in this position, especially if you do. I happen to ride the train to work almost every day, and when you see different people from all walks of life together get together in a confined space, and if it's really hot and humid out, that plays a role, and there have been times of tension. Between
Sure.
people who are different for one reason or another, they're having a bad day, or they're just racist assholes, any number of things. Yeah. So watching this almost like just brings you again into that experience of groundedness and relatability, yet there you mentioned it feeling very, very heightened in how a lot of these people interact with one another. That's very true too. There are moments where I'm like, yeah, I think somebody should be reacting more, but again, I think in these situations, people just don't want to get involved, and so they stay quiet, and that is really addressed here as well.
That's a lot of, I think, what the film was about. That kind of pure Kitty Genovese thing of like, yeah, I'm not going to risk my safety to help somebody else, even though that ultimately puts yourself at more risk. And that's one of the things that, that the film really is about, that too, that idea of like, oh, I'm not going to stand up for the old guy. I'm not going to stand up for the black guy. I'm not going to stand, because why should I risk myself? It's like, well, you're pretty much guaranteeing that you're going to be next on the list.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's like even a boyfriend, I'm just kind of like, come on, man, do something, say something, stand up, but who knows when you're in that situation, what you're feeling on the inside and how torn you are.
And that's the great thing, is that the film also does feel not judgmental or not simplistically judgmental, because I found, a lot of the behavior of the various people on the train not helping other people on the train awful. And I also recognized, and you know what? I don't know what I would do. And that's, I think, very powerful in a film. When you go, this is terrible behavior. Would I be any better? I think that's a really strong thing for a film to do.
Yeah, no, that's a great call there. I mean, you can think of it as a social commentary of the issues of the time, but also it's an examination of how society still works, again, sadly, to this day, in terms of, yes, not wanting to get involved with, these types of situations, and maybe it's a protective measure, but I don't know. There have definitely been moments where in life you do feel regret if you don't say something, or if you don't stand up, or if you don't intervene.
Absolutely. Oh, there are times I look back at incidents from my own youth when I didn't intervene to help somebody else, or even just for myself. Where it's like, I mean, when I got mugged, maybe I should have tried. And part of it goes like, or I could have ended up dead. But there's a human thing of like, how do you ever know when to be what kind of person? There's also a great moment in this that is so, I've forgotten about it, and you may need to edit it out because it's near the end of the movie. Although it's really not the plot of the movie at all. It's so relevant to right now. And it so captures like how things haven't changed. I mean, this is again a film that's 45 years old or 55, whatever the fuck it is now. At the end of the movie, there's been this whole drama, and a cop comes into the subway car because there's been a problem. And what does he do? Immediately goes to the black guy, assuming that he was the problem. And it only the whole thing lasts 10 seconds. And it's so disturbing and so powerful because it's like, okay, we've come no distance. And it was a brilliant touch. And apparently, I heard Pierce talk about it and say that was, again, something that was basically improvised. That wasn't written. But to me, it's one of the most powerful things in the movie. Because that's how that actually would be that way. It's like, here's this whole incident. We spent the whole movie watching these two white punks, terrorizing a colorway car full of people. A cop rushes in and immediately goes to the black guy and goes, okay, put your hands up. It's like... And I just thought, oh man, that is 1967, and it's also 2022.
Yeah, I know. That's what gets frustrating, especially when with things how they've been recently. It's just been so upsetting time and time again, on a political level, sociological level, on a human level, that when you go back and watch something like this, that sort of reinforces the fact that humanity is kind of lost in a lot of cases, in a lot of situations like this. And, again, this could, in somebody else's hands, this could have been like a Towering Inferno or a disaster movie. Where, like, oh, these terrorizers, they're going to do all these horrible things. And but it's, again, a sociological study in a way that also made me think of, particularly one sequence, but probably the entirety of a movie I need to see again because I've only seen it once. But Michael Haneke's Code Unknown.
Oh, I've never seen it.
Yeah, I've been meaning to go back to that because I wasn't sure how I felt about it on the first viewing, but I'm pretty sure he must have seen this movie because there's, again, I believe it's Juliette Binoche on a subway ride being harassed. And nobody's doing anything about it for like a extended period of time. But it's been a while since I've seen it, and this was a great discovery that I'm going to be picking up the Blu-ray of. I believe there's a commentary and other features on it.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff on there, and that's where I got the thing where Pierce was talking about the way they had done it, and that the moment with the cops and the black guy on the car. You know, that he talks about the whole. He's pretty articulate about the history of making it, which is really interesting.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I would love to learn more about it. So the next film. So this is actually in my top 10 favorite films. And that is Point Blank by John Borman, 1967. A crime film that centers on a character named Walker, played by Lee Marvin, who is a criminal that is seeking vengeance when his friend and partner in crime double-crosses him after a robbery that takes place on Alcatraz Island. And his friend shoots him at point-blank range, leaving him for dead in one of the prison cells. And he manages to survive those gunshot wounds, or does he? And that's the thing. You mentioned David Lynch earlier, and I, to some degree, what I love about movies is when they play like a fever dream. When you can't necessarily say this means that or this means this, that it kind of flows together in this fluid manner, but yet I always said too, if I were to teach a class on editing, I would show them this movie because I'd never seen editing like this. I don't think up until I saw this movie. And clearly a filmmaker like Steven Soderbergh would go on to use this type of editing to great effect with his film The Limey, which is very similar and very inspired by this movie, no doubt. And yet, it's all mysterious. It's all ambiguous. It's all unknown if this is really happening or not. And yet, at the same time, you can certainly think of it as happening in reality. But yeah, there's that sequence in the Go-Go Club where he goes looking for a friend of his wife's sister, I believe, and there's that moment where Angie Dickinson just slaps the shit out of Lee Marvin, and he barely.
Well, what's kind of amazing flinches. Is that it doesn't matter in a way if it's real or not. I mean, it matters at the end of the movie, but it's an amazing piece of storytelling that works either way you interpret it, whether it is the last moments of this man's life after his best friend and wife betray him in the middle of a robbery, and this is his fantasy of trying to get his own back, or whether it really is what happened. It's equally powerful. So while it's a really interesting question, it's not just the movie isn't like a gimmick movie and the question is it real or not? It's like it's just one more layer of what makes it a great movie, and that's to me the difference between something feeling like a gimmick and feeling like just part of the richness of it.
Yeah, it's kind of eerie in spots, like, and Lee Marvin is more of a cipher. It's kind of just because he doesn't emote a whole lot. He could be a ghost, you know.
But there's emotion underneath it, which is part of what I love about it.
Yeah, there's a sadness there. Yeah, I
think it's one of his best performances because, I mean, actually he gave a lot of great performances, but this was a really great. You know, because he plays a guy who wants to be that guy we see in movies, the man alone, the man who is the lone tough guy who's affected by nothing. And yet he and Borman find just enough moments where you see the cracks to go, he's in pain. He's not going to let people know he's in pain. He's going to macho his way through it. But, I mean, to me, the film is, because in a way, the plot's very common, straightforward. It's like I've been betrayed and I'm going to get revenge. But it's that echoed through stylistic choices that are like out of the European art films, and unlike the Beatty film where it felt forced on it, here you've got echoes of Godard and Bergman I saw and Truffaut and Antonioni, and yet it doesn't feel like I'm copying somebody else's techniques. It feels like I'm using those techniques to take a classic American noir kind of story and go way, way deeper. and deal with much bigger themes. And to me, it's really a movie about, America. We've grown up with this idea of the idealization of the lone tough guy. And this movie is about just how painfully alone and lonely it is to be that guy, and how pointless being an individualist can be in a modern world where even crime is no longer run by, guys in the street, but corporate guys in suits.
Yeah.
Like, the organization in this movie isn't the mafia. It's like a Fortune 500 company. So it's like, to me, it's this guy who's like this anachronism, and this really sad anachronism, trying to retain a sense of honor in a world where honor doesn't have a meaning anymore. And to me, that's a lot of thematic baggage for essentially what seems like a noir story.
Yeah, it almost comes full circle if we want to go. If you go back to Blast of Silence, because another film about loneliness and fatalism and just the futility of, accomplishing something that you think is going to have meaning. Like he really does think, oh, if I just get this money back, that'll complete me. That'll at least resolve all of this mess that I've been put through. And yet, in the end, that doesn't. And that's kind of what's amazing about the way this film ends. And I don't necessarily want to fully give it away, but it's, again, big question marks are left at the end. There isn't a sense of satisfaction with the character and for the audience. And I think that's what leaves some people frustrated, because a revenge thriller, you expect things to go a certain way. You expect everything to work out in the end for our protagonist. And when that doesn't happen, you're put in his mindset, his headspace at that time, because to me, it also can be viewed as this meditation on trauma and what he's experienced and what he's been through, and the fact that he's lost his wife and he can't really fully connect with other human beings after what he's been through. So, yeah, again, really sad. This movie really feels sad in the end.
It's a tremendously emotional movie that you do not think is going to be a tremendously emotional movie. Exactly. And that's always very interesting to me. Like, when you're watching a movie, the first time I saw it, I was so taken off guard by how complicated it was emotionally and thematically. Because, for the first while you go, oh, I know what this is. It's a really well done revenge thriller. And then it just goes deeper and deeper and deeper into some psychological places that are wildly more interesting than that. And even its commentary on how the world works is wildly more interesting than that. And in some ways, I gained a lot more on repeated viewings, because the first time you watch it, you're busy trying to figure out the plot, because that's what we do with a movie like that. Like, what's going to happen and who betrayed who. And that's understandable. But then once you've seen it and you know all those things, it's almost like on the other later viewings that I went, oh my God, there's so much I didn't even catch the first time around. Because I was busy trying to figure out, well, is that person on his side? And it's like, oh, none of that's even the point here. It's something way deeper than that.
Yeah, and the chronology feels off because of the editing techniques. I mean, it feels less like a narrative and more like a nightmare at times. And I think this has been done in other ways. I think even there's a 1999 remake called Payback, if I'm not mistaken, with Mel Gibson.
Oh, which I never saw, but I do believe was either inspired by or a remake of, yes.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was based on the same source material. But again, that's the more straightforward approach, whereas this is really audacious and downright experimental in execution at times, to where it is a little jarring. Like, the first time I saw it, I was like, I'm not sure if my brain can quite keep at it with this film, because I'm wanting to compartmentalize or piece the puzzle together in a way that I can make sense of. But it's more about the emotion, it's more about the themes, and it's more about this lost, lonely character who has been through a lot. And, I can see some people going, well, I don't know if I can completely connect with him either, because he's not emoting. But I really do think it was a collaboration between Borman and Marvin to sort of give it some emptiness, because there's times when he's not replying at all to people. He's just sitting there thinking in deep thought. Or when he goes and shoots the bed the way he does.
Yes.
There's just like this empty sadness because he didn't get to do what he wanted to do, and it sort of captures exactly what the film's about. It's going to leave you empty. Like, the futility of revenge, again, is something that I keep going back to with a lot of films where I go, that's a great theme that I always find fascinating to explore. And here it does it beautifully, and it's something that I go back to probably once a year at this point. It's become, like I said, one of my very favorite movies ever.
Well, and what I love about it is it's the futility of revenge, but through a specific lens of about a time and place, like a futility of revenge in the modern world where honor isn't even part of it anymore. Like, you could get revenge if revenge restored your honor or whatever, but in a world that's a corporate world, in a world where the $93,000 that he's obsessed with getting is chump change to a lot of the people he ends up dealing with, it's like, it becomes absurd because it's like, well, what revenge are you going to get? And that's part of what's so powerful about it, is like, it's also about how the world has changed, not just his own experience. But this is a guy when, getting back yours after being turned on and getting your $93,000 back, it's like, would have this real meaning. And part of what there's, again, this whole existentialist thing of like, what is it? But in this world, in this modern world, what does it mean?
No, that's a great point, because there's a lot of emphasis on the cityscape, like skyscrapers and viaducts, and just like how things have just changed environmentally. There's just these sort of confined offices and weird homes, and it feels just like a movie out of time, and he's out of time. Like, he's not going to connect with this new world that he's surrounded by. And I think Borman said that Renoir was an influence, but I was thinking of the director who did Last Night at Marienbad and
Renee. I'm never sure how you're supposed to pronounce it. Alain Renee.
Yeah. That director, that sort of approach to editing is there.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. It's like this very American revenge, robbery story, as if done by a European art master.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this fascinating mix of truly an art film and truly a down and gritty Don Siegel thriller, like somehow wedded together seamlessly.
Yeah. It's like they both went into the teleportation devices from The Fly.
Yes. Because in some ways that really shouldn't work. I mean, really, this is one of those films that, like, if somebody described to you what it was doing or trying to do, you'd kind of go, oh, that sounds weird and clunky, and yet it's seamless and it flows so beautifully and it just works. I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a truly masterful movie.
Yeah, and definitely, I'm sure you being you and the cinephile that you are, you probably have heard the commentary with Steven Soderbergh on this.
I have actually not listened to it yet. It takes me forever to get to commentaries. So I would just want to watch the movie.
Sure, I understand.
I love commentaries, but I start putting on and I start with the commentary and I go, I'm just going to watch the film again. So I have not heard a lot of the really good commentaries, although I've heard this is a really good commentary.
It's a very good commentary, absolutely. And Steven Soderbergh, clearly a masterful filmmaker who would go on to basically pay homage to this and then some with Terrence Stamp in The Limey, like I mentioned, which is another favorite of mine. So maybe
wonderful film, and definitely, it's funny. I had not thought about the connection because I hadn't also listened to but when you say it, I can absolutely see it. I absolutely get the passing of the baton on that one.
Yeah, well, I also don't want to keep you too long.
I'm actually doing okay.
Did you want to talk about one more?
I had said I could only do so long because I had to help my wife make dinner and everything. But she's caught up on a project of hers. So if we take a little more time, it's not going to be a problem.
Oh, good to hear. But yeah, I mean,
one thing as a little side note, I just noticed because you were talking about, and this is a place that you and I are very similar. How much you love films that are dreamlike and that take you into that kind of alternate reality dream space. And I'm looking at this list and going, that's basically, at least to some degree, every movie that we've just discussed.
Yeah, and why David Lynch is in my top 5 favorite directors.
Yes. Because, I mean, some of these are more grounded in reality, but none of these films feel like naturalistic, the way life works. They feel like a poetic and dreamlike and disturbing and slightly out of control reinterpretation of reality. And I hadn't really realized that about it until we got to the end of the conversation about them all and going, wow, okay, that's the theme that ties these all together.
And we never set out to do that. It just sort of happens organically that way.
That's what's so interesting. Is I always think it's interesting after you do something like this to go, oh, wait a minute, there's a theme there.
Yeah, and I know you only directed one episode of the show Legion, but that's a show that consistently felt dreamlike and not.
Oh, absolutely.
And you couldn't easily interpret every event that was taking place, or again, if it was really happening or not.
Yes.
Which is what I really appreciated about that show. And Noah Hawley in general kind of brings that quality more often than not. And maybe that's why he's perfect.
To me has a really lovely sort of dreamlike.
Yeah.
Oh, it ain't naturalistic reality. And well, as like the Coen brothers, which is what inspired the Fargo series. I mean, there's a lot of filmmakers that have a lot of the great filmmakers. That's part of what their genius is creating an alternate reality that still speaks to our reality. And that I think is really hard to do, but I think it's one of the things that film does better than any other medium.
Couldn't agree more. There are some honorable mentions that I wanted to bring up, and including, did you get to see A Married Couple by chance?
I did not. I apologize.
That's okay.
Suggested, and I'm sure, given the fact that you and I are so tracking each other's taste, that I can't imagine I won't like it. I just didn't get the time to sit down and watch it. That's
okay. It's definitely, again, very harrowing, very difficult to watch at times. It's a very cinema verite approach to documentary storytelling involving a married couple living in Toronto, I believe. And you basically just watch. They don't acknowledge the camera is there. It's funny that we brought up, I believe it was in our last conversation, Albert Brooks's Real Life, and this, and this is like what Albert Brooks probably intended to, or his character wanted to capture, was just people living day to day and seeing them interact, seeing them having breakfast, dealing with a dirty diaper, dealing with their kids and dealing with everyday events in this very vulnerable and incredibly naked, literally at times, with these characters. Like you watch them intimate, and experience marital conflict in ways that will feel very familiar to a lot of people who have lived with somebody for a long period of time. I mean, there are definite moments where you don't necessarily like what either of them are doing, but it's such a raw film. It does feel like a Cassavetes approach to filmmaking once again, only it's pure documentary about two real people dealing with everyday things like, should I buy this piano or not? Should I invest in this thing or not? Or, just like they just have regular everyday conversations that couples do have, and they definitely argue quite a bit. And the question in the end ultimately becomes, are they good for one another? And the film doesn't answer that, and it's incredibly powerful. It's one of my favorite documentaries, probably.
And it's amazing because it sounds like from what you're saying that it really doesn't feel like it actually works as a fly on the wall documentary, despite how inside someone's very personal life you are. Mm-hmm. I mean, because there's things like An American Family, which I think is fascinating, but like that piece, I feel like you always are aware that they're aware that there's a camera there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a really good question as to, are they acting for the camera at times? I mean, they don't look at the camera or ever acknowledge that there's a crew there in any sort of way. There's a certain moment where they probably are drunk and dancing to Sgt. Pepper, and something adorable like that automatically makes me think of my parents doing something like that late at night together. That's really endearing, but also just showing the dark side of being married, and in ways that I do often wonder about the editing of something like that. How do you sit down and decide, well, this should go, this should stay, this scene is boring, this one isn't, and how do you tell a story without a story in mind? Like, documentary filmmakers probably just find that, right? In the same way that we find themes when we talk.
I never made a documentary, but my wife's produced a couple of them, so I've sort of been around them by proxy. And it was amazing how to watch that process. It's a very different, at least in those cases, it's a very different process than when you do a fictional film or a scripted film, where you have this blueprint, and then it's all about how you're going to treat that blueprint, and you change things in editing, but you're coming in knowing what that is, as opposed to just having tens and hundreds of thousands of feet of footage, or in the video age, the equivalent of that, and then only in the editing room over time, really sorting out what it is the full story of that film is. And it certainly, the two films that she did, the editing process was far longer and more involved than the editing process on a narrative film. While the shooting process was actually shorter. I mean, but it was all about gathering as much footage as possible, and then really just taking all the time you needed to fully. It's like that thing they used to say about sculpture being, hidden in the marble, and then chip away the marble until you reveal the sculpture. That's what the editing certainly looked like to me on a documentary, was like chipping away that marble until the form underneath was revealed, which was pretty amazing to see. And I'm sure that's what they did with this. I'm sure they probably had hundreds of hours, and getting that down to 2 is really amazing piece of artistic work.
Yeah, and somebody like Frederick Wiseman is just constantly doing that, but probably making his films very long for a reason. I mean, he does have, probably hundreds of hours of footage, but manages to make a compelling story, even if it's well over 3 hours or something like that. So I'm sure the director of A Married Couple, Alan King, has made quite a few of those types of stories that I'll eventually catch up on. I know Criterion sort of put them out as a collection of some kind that I've been meaning to seek out. Yeah,
it was part of their Eclipse collection.
Right.
Which was DVD, but where they would do that, where they would take a lesser known filmmaker and put like 5 films in a box set. And that's, I think, still floating around out there.
Yeah, or people can find it on I think it's streaming on the Criterion channel if they have that. So seek that out for sure. I think I brought this up when we last talked that we were going to have a conversation about it, but I have in various capacities before, and that would be Bob Rafelson's Head, featuring the monkeys.
Oh, yes. Which is, that's one that I have not revisited in years, but man, what an entertaining film.
Yeah, I almost feel like we could have thrown it in here in the mix just for some levity.
and arguably perhaps should have.
Yeah.
Because it certainly, although it would have fit the theme I was talking about of dreamlike alternate reality. It's just, in that case, it's a really funny dreamlike alternate reality.
Oh, for sure. And, of course, The Swimmer by Frank Perry, which I did an extended bonus episode featuring film historian Sergio Mims. That's also one of those that I've seen 3 times and has now become an all-time favorite, with a transcendent performance from Burt Lancaster.
And is that up yet? Your piece you did? Because I'd actually be very curious to hear it.
Oh yeah, it's out, and I'll send it your way for sure.
Oh, cool. I'd love to hear that.
You come up at one point.
I think you told me that.
Yeah, I think I sent you a quick clip of him mentioning that.
Yeah, but I didn't know that meant. I didn't know if the whole thing was done, and I'd be very curious to listen to it, because I know how much you love that movie, and I have not seen it since I was literally like 19 years old, 18 years old, and I remember thinking it was amazing, but I hardly remembered it at all. So I was thinking of like listening to your piece and then going and rewatching it, or if you suggest, I'll rewatch it and then listen to your piece.
I would go that way. I would definitely go that route again.
Okay.
Very dreamlike at times, a little surreal, kind of like, I mean, just because, again, I would say that yes, everything is happening in that reality, but it's just such an odd reality he's living in, going to these different places and swimming in these different pools and having it all have, again, sociological commentary throughout about class and the potential that, yes, this character is having another mental breakdown. So that's a heavy movie, but well worth your time. Targets by the great Peter Bogdanovich. Have you seen that one?
Yes, I have seen that probably 3 times maybe over the years.
That's, again, a really unsettling thriller.
Yes. Yes.
Ugh.
And for me, I have some mixed feelings. I don't know that I think it completely works. I feel like the integration of the different strands sometimes don't mix as well, but I think it's so interesting for what it's trying to do on a thematic level and on a practical level. And it's because so much of that was devised around whatever they had, like 3 days with what's his name,
Boris Karloff.
Yeah, that they had to design the movie around this like very strange specific reality, and I feel like they pull it off surprisingly well. There are times I feel aware of it, but it is the more to me serious parts of it. The just portrait of a guy who is a sniper are very powerful.
Oh, for sure. Everything that takes place at that drive-in, too, is nail-biting, to say the least. And a couple more really quickly, but 2 titles that have come up on this show, mainly, I don't know, quite a while ago when I had my co-host and friend Patrick on. But both of these were brought to our attention, and we've championed them quite a bit. Again, Frank Perry with Last Summer, featuring Bruce Davison and Barbara Hershey in another really dark coming-of-age movie. It's like the dark side of a Swedish love story, which we talked about last time. It's a really depressing, upsetting film. Again, probably would have been too heavy to throw in this mix. And it's also hard to find, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was not able to find a reasonably good copy. It's a film I saw when I was a kid, but really a kid. I was probably too young to see it. I was probably 14 or 15. And it's a disturbing movie. Although 14 or 15, I guess you can handle that stuff. But I've never been able to find a reasonably good copy of it ever. I mean, usually sometimes you see films like that will show up on YouTube or whatever, and yeah, it won't be the greatest copy, but the only things I found are so ugly and missing sections and whatever that I've never re-seen it because I've never felt like I've had a chance to really re-see it in good quality.
Yeah, I think the only way Patrick got a copy of it at the time was through, I think they played it on the TCM channel, if I'm not mistaken. He DVR'd it.
Oh, that would have been the way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And Ebert was a huge fan of that film and, went on record as saying, if you want to see the ultimate, possibly the best Barbara Hershey performance ever. I think she was even nominated for it, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, it's you have to be you have to be prepared emotionally for that story.
Well, it just captures the nightmare dark side of adolescence, which is always a powerful, and again, does it in a somewhat dreamlike way. I remember I think I read the novelization of it when I was young too.
Wow.
And I thought, because, from that perspective, from my being 14, there was this weird mixed feeling about it being horrifying, but also these were the cool kids.
Sure.
They were having sex and they were doing drugs and all the things I wasn't quite in that world yet. So there was that weird sort of titillation and revulsion thing that you would get from that perspective that I'm sure I would have a completely different experience with, now, 45 years later, I'm sure those titillation elements would be gone and I would just be feeling, oh my God, this is really rough.
Yeah, let's get one of those great boutique labels out there, your Imprint, your
it's sort of surprising now that you say that somebody hasn't. That an MVD or there's a lot of interesting labels out there that are doing that stuff, and it has enough controversial material that you feel you could sort of sell it, the dark sex and violence-y sort of side of it. You could definitely sort of find an it's a film that there would be an audience for on that kind of cheesy selling it level. Sometimes with older films that are dramas, it's hard because people go well, who's going to buy it? But that film had enough of a reputation, and hopefully somebody's listening and are taking your word for it.
Yeah, maybe you could send a note to Indicator.
Yeah. I mean, I actually, this is not a bad idea because I do know people at some of those companies, and I don't know. I've never really done that thing of you should put this out, but I suppose I should take advantage of having those connections and see if I could ever influence it.
Yeah, for sure. And last but not least, The Servant from Joseph Losey with Dick Borgard? Or, yeah, that's Dirk. Dirk Borgard.
Sure.
Yes.
Dick was his less famous brother. It was,
Yeah, though that's a... Whew, talk about power dynamics at play, to say the least, in The Servant. That's an understatement.
another film I am way overdue to re-see. A film I saw when I was first falling in love with film, like late teens, whatever, and remember images and scenes, but I am so due to actually see it again to be able to say anything intelligent about it.
I think it was actually put out in 4K in the UK recently.
Yes, I actually ordered it. I think I have a copy of it here. I just haven't sat down and watched it yet.
Oh my, I need to get that like tomorrow. Okay. Those are my honorable mentions. Keith, do you have some that I know made your initial list?
I'll try to keep it to a reasonable number because, damn, once you start opening the door, it's like, there's so many.
Right.
But a few that I would mention just, one for me, and it may be too well known to fit in this, but Scorsese's first feature, Who's That Knocking at My Door? I think is a remarkable first film. I think in many ways it's as good as Mean Streets, which is the film that really put him on the map a couple of years later. It's stylistically gorgeous. It's shot in this beautiful black and white. There's like one shot alone that goes on for like 12 minutes in a single shot, and does so very effectively. There's a sequence in the middle of it that is on a cinema making level. It was completely forced into the film. Basically, the financier said, you have to put in a sex scene. So what did Martin Scorsese do when somebody said you have to put in a sex scene? He shot this completely surreal, fascinating rock video of a scene to The Doors' The End.
Yes.
Before Francis Coppola used it in many years before Coppola used it in Apocalypse Now. And that sequence alone is worth the price of admission because it's erotic and disturbing and surreal and what is this? But it's also just Who's That Knocking? It's just a good movie. I mean, it's a character study, and in some ways, yes, it's very dated because it's about a culture where the young female lead has been raped, and yet that makes her sort of like worth less to the men of that time and that culture. The Harvey Keitel plays this guy and he kind of is in love with her, but because she's no longer a virgin, even though she was raped, he's like, well, I don't know how I feel about you, which is horrifying. But really is different specific in the way women are objectified, but not necessarily different from the theme of women being objectified that you could say is the Me Too movement right now. And it's just, the acting is really good. It's powerful. It looks amazing. It was made for nothing. So that's a film that, I know Scorsese fans will know it, but I feel like I'm still surprised how many people even who say they're Scorsese fans have never seen it, and it is findable. So that's one that I would definitely recommend. Another one that I would say is worth tracking down, you can sort of find it online, is a very early Altman film called Nightmare in Chicago.
I need to see that, the Chicago Connection again.
Very cool. It's not a great movie, but it's a very, very good movie. It's about a serial killer. It's just so uncharacteristic of Altman. It's so interesting to see what he was doing early on. It was actually made for television as a made-for-TV movie, and then I gather it was then released theatrically in a limited way after that. The acting is really good. The suspense is really good. And for the time, it was a surprisingly complicated portrait of a serial killer. It was not, again, just the killer, evil cartoon killer from hell. You don't like the guy. He's horrible, but you actually see him as a human being, an awful human being, but a human being. And it's just a very effective film made for nothing. And just, if you're interested in Altman's work, very worth seeking out. I'll throw a couple more in. Another Buñuel film that's less known, and I have not re-seen it myself in a while, but I love, is Simon of the Desert, which is often, people forget about it because it's like a 45-minute short.
Right.
But it's spectacular looking. It's spectacular in its ideas. It's basically a Christ figure in the desert, sort of surrounded by these various figures that are all related to Bible figures, but put through Buñuel's odd sense of humor and surrealism. But is one of the more effective films on religion that I can remember seeing. It's sort of, if you made Last Temptations of Christ on acid, you might do something like this. but it often gets overlooked in his filmography because it's more of a short, but it's a long short, and it's and I think Criterion put it out at least on DVD at one point, and it's a really just, if you like Buñuel, it's one of those, I like Buñuel and I've never seen movies that you really should see. And I'll throw one other one in there, which is there's a French film that got very little attention in the States, but is wonderful, called The Shameless Old Lady. I forget what La Dame something is the French title, and it's by René Clair, I think, from 1966. I'm going off of memory here, but it's basically an adaptation of a Brecht film about this, sweet little old lady, and her husband dies, and rather than being this sad movie about how she lives alone, and she suddenly comes to life. And at age whatever, I mean, the actress certainly looks like she's well into her late 70s, suddenly is hanging out with a prostitute and going to bars and having this very alive life that she'd never been able to have while she was busy fulfilling her role as a wife and mother and grandmother. And it's very funny, and it's very sweet, very humanistic. It manages to be a real piece of social critique at the same time that it's just completely enjoyable and completely sweet and funny and odd. And the lead woman in it, who I think, had never done another film before or since, she was it was great. I mean, and that's another one that, you have to kind of look around to find it. I don't know if there's even a US DVD release. There is a VHS that was made forever ago. You could track down. But again, I think, you can sometimes find it on, YouTube or whatever, and they have subtitles with it, and it's just really worth seeing. It's that rare kind of, the French are good at that. They're very these humanistic movies that are both really funny but have a lot more going on at the same time.
Well, that's great.
So I would say that those are all, those would be, I guess, my few that I throw in, but a lot more we could talk about.
Oh, certainly. And there was one that I did watch that I just felt really torn about talking about. And I think you know which one I'm talking about.
Yes. Sundays and Sibel.
Sibel, yeah. Again, it's gorgeously shot. There's amazing moments in it. It was really hard to watch.
Yeah,
for obvious reasons.
Yes, it's definitely disturbing. Although that's kind of why I really like it too, because it tells of a sort of romance, and there are kind of intimate. I mean, it's about a romance between a young girl. I mean, she's 11 or something in the movie, and there's a French veteran of the French Indochina War comes back home and is clearly emotionally screwed up and
PTSD for sure.
Yeah, major PTSD back before it was called PTSD. And it's this friendship that they have that he develops with this girl, but it's a romance. And there's no specific intimation that anything sexual ever happens between them, but there is a sexual energy between them. And it's really weird because she's this little girl, and he clearly is damaged in a way where he sees her with love, and love that isn't appropriate necessarily to an 11-year-old girl. Yet, because nothing actually happens in the film that we're aware of, at least, I feel like it doesn't cross the line, because what it's really about is his need for love and connection, and her need for love and connection. They're both, she comes from this not good family situation. And so it's kind of like this thing of in a world of pain, is any love a good love? Obviously, if it crossed into actual sexual activity, you go, no, that's really not okay. But this kind of sweetly platonic but deeply romantic relationship, for me, is a fascinating line to be walking, because it's sort of wrong and creepy, and it's sort of like you go, oh my God, I just want you two to be happy, and if that means pretending they're in love with each other and just forgetting the world exists, I want that for both of them. And so to me, the very fact that it's so confusing to watch makes it a really interesting movie.
Yeah, confusing and complex and challenging in all the ways that, yes, great films can do. And again, it was one of those we talked about a lot, another film about loneliness and a desperate need to connect. in some way. It's just also challenging in knowing whether or not this is acceptable, and the people in the movie, like those that he's associated with, do question that too.
Oh yeah, no, it's clear that the film is saying this is very dangerous ground.
Yeah.
Because should it turn into a literal sexual relationship, it obviously would be, completely inappropriate and completely damaging to this sweet little girl. But because it sort of stays on the side of it's about emotion, not physicalization of the love, I feel like, I don't know, I can emotionally go there and go, yeah, it's disturbing and it's a question, but would it really be better for him to kill himself and her to feel completely alone in the world than have this sort of inappropriate but not acted out inappropriate relationship? And, that's, to me, a really valid question.
And I think it's one of those movies, on a first viewing, you're bound to wrestle with it on some level, I would think. And maybe if I go back in, for another few years or so, knowing what I'm in for, I will be a little bit more open towards this scenario. It wasn't like I, shunned it and just went, ugh, this is too gross, I can't watch this. It wasn't that. It was just, again, feeling a lot of different things while watching it.
And that's, to me, why I really like it.
Yeah.
That's why I'm really a big fan of it, because I enjoy feeling those complicated, confused feelings. I enjoy, and I think you do too with some of the films you've talked about, I actually find that rewarding to go, I don't know how I feel about this. I have to think about it. I have to kind of look at it from different lenses. And I think that's one of the things film does wonderfully. And I think they can be very valuable at making us really question, well, where are my boundary lines? What is appropriate? What isn't appropriate? How do we judge other people and what their emotional needs are? I think those are great things for films to examine.
I agree completely. No, for sure.
I mean, there's some things where you look back and go, yeah, you look at some of the films that in the 70s were like considered okay. There's like the Murmur of the Heart, where a kid sleeps with his mother, and there's the Blier film, the Pierre or whatever, where again the 14-year-old, 13-year-old girl seduces her stepfather, and I kind of go, like, yeah, that's sort of a moment, and it really does seem deeply creepy now and not okay. But this film doesn't fall into that realm for me. I mean, there definitely were films during the height of the really sexual revolution, There Should Be No Boundaries, that you go, yeah, that's not all right. This movie for me doesn't fall into that. It kind of goes into a much more rich and complicated emotional zone.
Yeah, and at the same time, I struggle with, actively recommending it, just because it is a sensitive time where we're sort of examining grooming in some capacity, where we're thinking a little bit more deeply about the kind of relationships that men can have that are inappropriate, clearly, when they lead to something sexual. And in this case, it doesn't. So I can see, being more open towards this as a positive experience. I think it's just, it's hard. It's hard. It's really hard in some cases where there are some topics where I'm going like, this is really crossing a line in a way for me, possibly. But at the same time, there's a lot of value to be had in having those complex feelings watching a film.
Sure. And it's also very personal. I mean, obviously, in a way, I hope this serves as nothing else as a trigger warning for people, because there are people that, there are people who've had experiences in their past where it's like, you wouldn't want to see this movie because you might not have had this experience, but it may trigger enough of a feeling or memory that they would be very disturbing to you. So I definitely think being aware of it and being alerted to it. But I also think, if you go in knowing that this does not lead to where you get afraid it might lead to, there's not suddenly some scene with the two of them in bed. If you know that, you may then be able to watch it with a sense of, okay, this isn't that movie. This is really a movie about, well, what is love and what's acceptable. And I think that's a useful thing. But it definitely, I could see it being very personal. I could see somebody being completely turned off. I mean, when you expressed, it's funny because it didn't really bother me at all when I saw it. Maybe because I think I'd read reviews about it, so I kind of knew what the boundary lines were. So I watched it and just really was very moved by it. But when you described your reaction, I can't say that I was like, oh, that's crazy. I was like, oh, yeah, okay, I can see that.
Yeah, and at the same time, I had a very mixed reaction to Todd Solondz's Happiness when I first saw it. That's for sure.
Sure.
And that was one of the first times I remember feeling that challenged in like, oh, I'm supposed to have empathy for a pedophile in this movie? And like...
But I really feel like with that movie, that was the point, was like challenging you to go,
Yep.
What do you think about this? And I do think that's, I almost feel like that's always okay for a piece of art to ask.
Mm-hmm.
I think if the art says, and I'm telling you it's okay, that to me crosses a whole different set of lines. But I didn't think for a second, like at least when I remember of Happiness, and again, I haven't seen it since it was first released, but I never felt like we were supposed to feel approving of that character or what he did.
Exactly.
Just that he was still a human being even then. And that goes back to a movie like M. I mean,
sure.
When Peter Lorre is standing and saying, I can't help myself, and the world was shocked because, oh my God, this is a child murderer and theoretically implied child sexual molester as well, and yet you're going, I feel bad for him. I shouldn't be feeling that. I think that's actually a really interesting thing that art does sometimes, is make you go, here's somebody you should hate. I mean, it can be a portrait of Adolf Hitler. It can be whatever. And then make you go, and now I'm going to make you see that they're still a human being, and you're going to have to deal with what that leaves you with. And I actually think that's a valid, if disturbing and hard, thing for art to do.
Oh, that's such a great point. Yeah. And I obviously appreciate that experience, clearly, with some of the choices we've made for this episode. And again, I'm very grateful, and I am so excited to go back yet again in a year with you.
Yes.
To the 1950s. Does anything like, I mean, obviously we didn't prepare anything in advance. Does any titles off the top of your head for a possibility for the 1950s?
I mean, again, it's all going to be with the dividing line of how well known is well known.
That's true.
Immediately comes to mind is In a Lonely Place.
Yep.
Which is a very, very favorite film, and I'm surprised at how many people seem to not know it.
It's funny you mentioned that film, because that the director's other work came to mind, which would be Bigger Than Life.
Yes.
Oh.
The problem is we could just do a whole Nick Ray show, really.
Oh, yeah, and I have. I love Nicholas Ray. He's one of my favorites.
That makes sense.
So we'll definitely touch upon those titles, and we'll come up with a list like we always do later in the year. Well,
that's always half the fun. Is I wish we could let the audience know on that, but you and I going back and forth going, what about this? What about that? I always love that part of it too.
Yeah, no, for sure. And hearing and seeing some of your recommendations that I will eventually catch up with if I do within the year, I'll shoot you a message, of course, and be like, hey, I'm so glad I watched this one too.
I like it when it goes both ways. Please send ideas, because I'm always looking to see something I haven't.
Thank you so much. You always bring so much to the show, and I'm so grateful on so many levels. It really means a lot to me. I find your insights so exciting to listen to that if you do find the time in your busy schedule, you probably should just start your own movie podcast, to be honest.
Well, but I kind of like doing them with friends. Sure. There's a few of these that I do with people I really like and admire, and I find that much more fun. The sharing of stuff, I really enjoy that, and so I like coming into your world. I mean, that's really interesting to me.
Yes, and it always is a joy for me as well. I'm sure you're busy with your career. Is there anything in the works or anything that folks can look forward to, possibly?
Not this second, because really I got really waylaid, and I was comfortable with it by COVID.
Sure.
Being a little older and having asthma and other things, I did not feel comfortable for going back on a set for a while, because sets are like, if you could design a place that would be a really bad, how do you come up with something that's a likely place to get COVID? Well, put a whole bunch of people who've probably traveled there from all over the world, jam them together in a small interior space, have them work very intimately, with some people not being able to wear masks because they're actors. I was frankly chicken. I just felt like it seems really dangerous to me. Now, as vaccinations and everything change, now I'm feeling quite differently about it, and I'm sure I will go back now. But there was a good 18 months where I was like, I'm not doing that. It's not worth dying over an episode of a TV show, or I think if somebody had said, "Here, we'll give you millions of dollars to make the film, or even $1 million to make one of your own babies," one of my projects that I really wanted to do, that would have been different. But we'll see. I mean, I have things in the works, but they're always in the works. The independent film thing, it's like as I often say, getting from nowhere to very close is easy, and getting from very close to here's an actual check, go make the actual movie is the impossible part.
Sure.
So the project that I don't want to go into too much detail about in terms of names, but I'd be on it as a producer, not as a director. And my wife and I have been working on it for 15 years.
Oh, wow.
And did get a humongous star, like, A+ list star, to say they would do it for not much money. But it's still hard. Oh. It's amazing. It's like we kind of went, oh, this is going to be really easy now. And instead, we're still getting we love them. And we love this piece of writing, but it's not very commercial, and it's not going to be easy to make money on it. And it's like, oh my God. So we'll see. But this is a very particularly tough time. I think I don't know how much your listeners are interested in the business side of the business, but the dying of the old models of what you do with a movie in terms of the theater and what happened with COVID and all that, and the struggles that places like Netflix have gone through, where suddenly they're model where everything was super profitable but become less so, and there's not a clean model of how you make a grown-up serious movie right now.
Yeah.
And guarantee a return. So most of them that are getting made are because individual investors are stepping up and taking a chance on something, and that's a tough thing to chase, because you got to find just the right person at just the right moment. So right now there's a lot less production coming out of the art film world. It's happening, but usually there's either a genre element that's strong, or some reason that it's like, oh, we know we can pre-sell this, just based on the log line or something. So it is a particularly difficult time. Now that will continue to evolve, but it's a weird moment for the kinds of films that I'm drawn to.
Well, as a lifelong fan, I just want more work.
Well, thank you. Well, I far from given up. I mean, like I say, there was a year and a half sort of sabbatical in there, but now I'm back to it. There's a project that I wanted to direct for many, many years that I'm currently examining to see if I could drop a zero off of the budget. I've had some friends and acquaintances make movies for ridiculously low sums, so I'm trying to look at what does that really mean. What does it mean to make a movie for $200,000 instead of $2 million? What limitations would I face? What freedoms would I gain? And so that's the other thing I'm really focused on, is taking something I wanted to do since 2001, when I first got the rights to the book, and saying, can I make this that small and still make the movie that I want to make? So that's part of the work that's going on right now. Yeah,
I know it's not easy. Another one of my favorite filmmakers, Sarah Polley. She's took her 10 years to make her new movie, and it's coming out later this year. I believe it's a book adaptation called Women Talking, with a dream cast, if there ever was one. Good Lord. I know one of my new favorites, Jessie Buckley, is among them. So
I love her, and I'm excited to see anything she does.
Yeah, and definitely check out her book that she just recently put out too. It's something, especially what she brings up regarding Terry Gilliam. It's
interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, again, a lot of it's pretty heavy, but yeah, she's just always been one of those. I mean, even before she directed, I was always drawn to her as an actress, and now, every film she's made, I think, is incredibly strong, and now finally a new one, so I'm just hoping the same for you in the future.
Well, I got to know Sarah just a little bit when I was auditioning for Waking the Dead, because she kept, I kept bringing her back to the role that Jennifer Connelly played. They were sort of ended up being kind of my two last choices, and she just was too young.
Sure.
Just putting her next to Billy, she just looked like a kid, but her work was so phenomenal, and her intelligence and what she brought to it as an actress was so amazing that I was immediately, and then as a person, when you sit and talk to her, she was so smart. And so it's been really fun watching her, blossom into this amazing filmmaker. And I know she's one of those people I'm always rooting for.
Yeah, same here. And I'll always be rooting for you as well, sir.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough for another enlightening and passionate conversation. Really, thank you so much for taking the time to talk great cinema, and let's do it again in a year when we go back to the 1950s.
Absolutely.
Awesome, man. Well, take care, and all the best to you and your family, all right?
You too, my friend.
Okay. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.